Without a doubt, Quentin Tarantino is one of the best to ever do it, having delivered a near-flawless filmography including the likes of Reservoir Dogs, Pulp Fiction, and Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. But even with plenty of rewatches of your faves, there's probably loads of things you've missed. So get your gourmet coffee in the pot as myself, Josh, Gareth, and Ellie dive into all 9 of the writer-director's films. This is What Culture, and here are 178 things you somehow missed in Quentin Tarantino's movies.
Reservoir Dogs. Number 18, related characters. As with just about every Quentin Tarantino movie, there are of course connections in Reservoir Dogs with the other films that Tarantino has made. Of course, the most famous connection is that Vic Vega, played here by Michael Madsen, is actually the brother of Vincent Vega, played by John Travolta, in Pulp Fiction. However, another familial connection that might not be as obvious concerns the Nash family. See, Marvin Nash is one of the few characters whose full name is revealed throughout Reservoir Dogs, and can be connected to the unseen, sort of, Gerald Nash, another boy in blue from Natural Born Killers. Along with the not-so-well-liked Seymour Scagnati, Vic Vega's parole officer, and his brother, Natural Born Killers' Jack Scagnati, there is one more sibling pairing. This once again connecting Reservoir Dogs to Pulp Fiction. See, Mr. White from Reservoir Dogs is actually the brother of Jimmy Dimmock, played by Tarantino, in Pulp Fiction. So yeah, apparently Jimmy just chose to ignore the fact that Mr. Wolf looks exactly like his dead brother, but hey, who said this had to make exact sense? It's just cool. Number 17, zero female presence. Quentin Tarantino is no stranger to bringing to life strong, compelling female characters, but there are none to be seen in his first effort. Throughout Reservoir Dogs, there's not one single female character outside of the woman who puts the bullet in Mr. Orange's gut, and not a single word spoken by a female character at all. Things of course changed just 2 years later with the release of Pulp Fiction, but for all intents and purposes, Reservoir Dogs is a total boys club. Number 16, who is True Blue? Tarantino, of course, has a knack for creating iconic opening sequences, and Reservoir Dogs' breakfast scene is definitely up there with the best. While discussing Madonna's work, the group ponders who exactly is True Blue. The song itself references Madonna's feelings for her then husband Sean Penn, however, the reference in the movie goes a little bit deeper than that. At the beginning, the men sit around asking which one is True Blue, while in just a few hours' time, they'll all be asking the very same question again, this time trying to figure out which of these very same men wears the blue of the police force. Number 15, Eddie doesn't talk about Madonna. As the group of men sit around talking about Madonna's work, there is one guy who is suspiciously absent all the way throughout the exchange. With so much dialogue being shot back and forth between these characters, it might be easy to miss the fact that nice guy Eddie doesn't say a word during the entire Madonna conversation. Which is a bit strange because usually he's quite a chatty guy. However, his omission in this conversation has nothing to do with his character in the movie or the narrative at large, but actually the actor playing Eddie. The character is played by Chris Penn, brother of Sean Penn, who, as I just said, was married to Madonna at one point. So in this scene, out of respect for his former sister-in-law, the actor just chose to be silent. Number 14, Mr. Orange ratted out Mr. Pink. Outside of Madonna, one of the first subjects in Reservoir Dogs to get a proper lengthy debate is the concept of tipping, and specifically Mr. Pink's refusal to do so, even when it's just $1 he's asked to kick into the pot. In this scene, Joe offers to pay for the meal so as long as his crew cover the tip, though when he returns to the table, he's $1 short. And when he asks who hasn't chipped in, Mr. Orange immediately points the finger at Mr. Pink. Now at the time, this doesn't really require too much thought. You might just assume that the men have respect for Joe and are trying to rat out Mr. Pink because, I mean, who doesn't tip $1 when everyone else is throwing in? However, this does have a deeper meaning because, of course, it's Mr. Orange who, without hesitation, immediately rats out Mr. Pink because, of course, he himself is the undercover police officer that they eventually try to finger. Number 13, the advert for Jack Rabbit Slims. Mr. Blonde's death scene is of course one of the most memorable parts of the entire movie, and no doubt the one that people have rewatched over and over again. However, even with that in mind, there is one detail that slips most viewers by. And that's right after the iconic track Stuck in the Middle with You ends on the radio playing in the scene, we get a very brief advert for Jack Rabbit Slims. Jackrabbit Slim's is, of course, the 50s diner in which Vincent Vega, the dying Mr. Blonde's brother, danced with Mia Wallace in Pulp Fiction. And what's even more impressive about this detail is that Jackrabbit Slim's as a thing doesn't even show up on screen until Pulp Fiction, which was released 2 years after this movie. Number 12, Mr. Blonde's drink. Another link between Tarantino's first two movies is a shared trait between Vic Vega and Jules Winfield. Now the two, of course, are connected with Winfield working with Vic's brother Vincent, but it turns out they're also linked by the fact that they both enjoy drinking a tasty fast food beverage, and both choose to do it in strikingly similar ways. Now while there's no official confirmation that Vic in fact got his drink from Big Kahuna Burger, it is a good shout. I mean, where else is he gonna get it from? 2 years later, Jules made the fictional franchise iconic, of course, while eating and drinking Brett's meal, but Vic did it first. Number 11, the real function of the warehouse. The majority of Reservoir Dogs, of course, takes place in a warehouse that the team uses as their rendezvous point. However, there are a few details in the set dressing that suggest that this is a far more morbid setting than just a regular old warehouse. While interesting set design in their own right, the hearse and the coffins are also nothing short of perfect foreshadowing for the fact that only one man that entered the warehouse on screen would ultimately leave it alive, and even then probably was killed soon afterwards. Number 10, who is Marcellus Spivey? While some Tarantino-verse connections seem quite obvious, others are a little bit more of a stretch and aren't really confirmed, but still, they're fun to talk about. And one of these comes in Reservoir Dogs, with the dropping of a name that doesn't really have any weight in this movie, but will retroactively once Pulp Fiction came out. See, one of the main and certainly most influential characters in Tarantino's second movie is Marcellus Wallace. He's a powerful gangster at the center of all three of that flick's chapters, but he may have already been mentioned in Reservoir Dogs under the name Marcellus Spivey. Now, Marcellus isn't the most common name in the world, so who's to say that these aren't the same characters with swapped out last names? Hey, let's go one step further. Maybe the Marcellus that sold Larry's diamonds before going to prison for 20 years escaped, changed his name to Marcellus Wallace, and then moved into the narcotics game away from shifting stolen ice. Is it a bit of a stretch? Probably, but it is still fun to speculate about. Number 9, Mr. Pink's new job. Okay, staying on wacky fan theories for just a second. So, the only person who makes it out of Reservoir Dogs alive is Mr. Pink, and while it is implied that he is gunned down as soon as he leaves the warehouse, what if he did survive? What if Mr. Pink managed a second miraculous escape of the day, and after the entire ordeal with the diamonds was just put off a life of crime? Consequently, an unskilled worker with absolutely no experience then turns to the only job that he can find, which is a waiter slash Buddy Holly impersonator at Jackrabbit Slim's. Because Steve Buscemi, of course, plays Mr. Pink in this movie and has a cameo in Pulp Fiction as the Buddy Holly waiter, maybe it's not as ridiculous as this first appears. Number 8, what happened to Mr. Pink's diamonds? With the heist hitting the fan almost immediately, the bulk of the movie mainly becomes about survival. Mr. Pink, however, does claim that he did retrieve a bag of diamonds from the heist, even though the audience never actually sees them. So what actually happened to these diamonds by the end of the movie? Well, we're back into fan theory territory, but one that has raged for decades now. This, of course, is the fan theory that suggests that these are actually what was in the briefcase that Vincent and Jules took for Marcellus Wallace in Pulp Fiction. It's just a minor detail in Reservoir Dogs itself, but it's taken on a life of its own in the years since. Number 7, Five Guys. Joe's plan to rob a diamond store in broad daylight required the use of trusted professionals. However, it seems like Joe himself forgot about how many guys he was hiring for the job. At first, he tells Larry that it's a 5-man job, despite the fact that there are clearly 6 people wearing the black suits. This is explained away later though, as Mr. Blonde wasn't added until later on in the heist planning. And yet, when Joe actually has his team together and is giving his instructions, he loses count of his men once again. He reels off the aliases of Mr. Brown, Mr. White, Mr. Blonde, Mr. Blue, Mr. Orange, and Mr. Pink, before then referencing that there are 5 men carrying out the job. He literally just went through a roll call of 6 names and then says that if anything goes wrong, it'll be 5 men in a bullpen. Now this mistake is reportedly because actor Lawrence Tierney misspoke during the scene, but if you look at the line in the vacuum of the movie, did he subconsciously know or at least suspect that one of his guys was a cop and couldn't join the rest of him in prison? Probably not, but it does kind of maybe explain it as a kind of spooky prescience that this character has. Number 6, Mr. Orange is a comics nerd. In showing how a cop called Freddy prepared for the biggest and final role in his life, Tarantino delved into the backstory of who he is and what he was all about. And one of the biggest aspects of this character, weirdly, was his love of Marvel Comics. Don't believe me? There is evidence all around his scenes. Of course, there is the obvious big Silver Surfer poster next to his mirror when he convinces himself that the crew doesn't suspect a thing, but there's still more. In Another Thing, he likens Joe to the Thing from the Fantastic Four, and then there are also Iron Man and Thing action figures that can be seen around his coffee table. So yeah, who knows, if Mr. Orange survived and decided he didn't want to be a cop anymore, he might have been working for WhatCulture.com in another 10, 15 years. Number 5, the swinging door. In the warehouse where the bulk of the movie takes place, the door at the far end that anyone who comes in and out uses reportedly just kept swinging open on the day. This was such an issue that it apparently caused havoc in shots where the door was supposed to be closed. And while most of these were edited around, there is one scene where the issue is in the final cut and the actors just roll with it. In one scene, Harvey Keitel strode across the room amid conversation with Chris Penn and Michael Madsen, shut the door, and then walked back without skipping a single beat. The moment wasn't planned, it was just incorporated into the scene naturally, and Tarantino decided to keep it in. Number 4, conversations in the mirror. The connection between Mr. Orange and Mr. White, of course, works as the emotional heart of Reservoir Dogs. It's never fully explored why White had such a connection to Orange, but they do have a few things in common that are shown in the film. Aside from both being fearless, the two have a similar relationship with themselves in that they both sought some sort of comfort, confidence, or reassurance from talking to themselves in the mirror. For Mr. White, it's when he was telling Mr. Pink about the last job he had that was infiltrated by an undercover cop, while for Mr. Orange, it was about psyching himself up just before he went to meet the actual people on the job. Number 3, the true value of the wedding ring. For the most part, Freddy is shown to be a pretty good actor when he's performing his role while he's undercover. He meticulously rehearses his story about the drug deal gone wrong, and there's also the tiny detail of his wedding ring, which he slips on every time he's playing the character and seeing the other guys. The ring is never mentioned outright, though just before he goes out to Eddie's car, he turns back into his apartment to retrieve it from a tray of loose change. As Freddy, he never wears the ring, but as Mr. Orange, he's never without it. It's obviously an important part of his cover story. And though it is invaluable in protecting his story, the true value of the wedding ring cannot be shown by the fact that he just keeps it in the same regard as likely less than $1's worth of spare change. That's how little it means to him as an actual person. Number 2, the colored bottles. After the opening credits, the movie kicks into overdrive, immediately picking up with the heist gone wrong. And while White and Pink head into a different room to the screaming and panicking Mr. Orange, they enter into a somewhat heated discussion over who the rat could be. Had they just turned around and looked at the bottles right behind them, though, they might have had a little bit of a suggestion to help them figure out that Mr. Orange was, of course, the rat. See, in this scene, there were 3 colours of bottles, white, pink and orange, exactly the same as the aliases of the men at the warehouse. On the left, there were white and pink together with a big gap between them, and the orange on its own on the right. Clearly, orange was different from the others because Mr. Orange was a cop. Number 1, Mr. White sat between Joe and Mr. Orange. One of the biggest threads throughout the movie is that none of these men are supposed to know each other. That's the whole point of the aliases in the first place. However, that's not entirely true. See, Mr. White knew Joe, while Mr. Blonde was very close with both Joe and his son Eddie. Even outside of this, there was a certain relationship that was sparking between Mr. White and Mr. Orange, so much so that the former defended the latter with his life. When Joe rocks up to the warehouse later on in the movie, he's absolutely sure that Mr. Orange is the rat that he's looking for. But in this scene, of course, Mr. White stands between them because he doesn't want to see his friend killed for something that he doesn't believe to be true. And this was telegraphed right at the very beginning of the movie when the men are sitting around the table eating, as Mr. White is situated right between Joe and Mr. Orange, just as he would be in the standoff at the very end of the film, Pulp Fiction. Number 20, well-placed board games. One of the finest pieces of foreshadowing in Pulp Fiction comes in the foreground of the scene where Lance and Vincent are prepping Mia for her life-saving adrenaline shot. Here, there are two board games that are visible, those being Operation and Life. And, well, could there be any better placed props in a scene where such an injection is about to take place? In this scene, of course, Lance and Vincent both held Mia's life in their hands, and also their own, as they were certain to be killed by Marcellus Wallace should they be seen to be in any way responsible for her potential death. Number 19, Butch's black and white background. There are several key scenes in Pulp Fiction that take place in a moving vehicle. And of course, in each of these scenes, the background outside of the windows are brought to life by classic movie magic. However, there is something very strange about Butch's cab ride with Esmeralda that you might not have noticed even upon a rewatch. And that's because if you only focus on the dialogue here, or on looking at the two characters in general, you might have missed that the background is completely in black and white. Now, scouring the internet, it's difficult to find any kind of explanation for this stylistic choice, but it certainly isn't the last time that Quentin Tarantino would utilize black and white in his movies. Number 18, bad things happen when Vincent goes to the bathroom. There are so many themes, trends, and details running all the way throughout Pulp Fiction that it would be impossible to keep track of all of them. However, one of these is of course the repeated motif that Vincent always seems to need the bathroom, and this is a detail you almost certainly noticed before. And Tarantino has explained that the reason for his constant trips to the bathroom is because Vincent's heroin use actually makes him constipated, and thus he always tries to go and, well, do his business. And that's why he also takes ages while he's on the pot. However, what's harder to discern is that there is a common theme that links all of these trips to the bathroom as well, and that's that every time old Vincent attends the little boy's room, something bad is guaranteed to happen. If you don't believe me, just think that Mia OD'd while he was talking to himself in the mirror, Butch came home and gunned him down as he finished up in there, and it was while he was in the bathroom at the diner that Pumpkin and Honey Bunny tried to rob the whole place. So yeah, it might be correlation and not causation, but every time this guy goes to do his business, something terrible goes down. Number 7, Vincent's bathroom book. Now, bad things may always happen when Vincent goes to the little boy's room, but at least every single time he does go to do his business, and I've said that phrase far too many times in this video, he always makes sure he's going to be as comfortable as possible by bringing a certain book. And the book in question is Modesty Blasé, a spy novel by Peter O'Donnell surrounding the titular character, and may have gone some way to inspiring Mia's Fox Force 5 character, but more on her later. Later on in the movie, though earlier on in the movie's chronological timeline, you can also see Vincent reading this book when he's in the diner. Number 16, Jodie's love of needles. Vincent reviving Mia is of course up there with one of Pulp Fiction's most iconic scenes. However, despite how many times you may have seen this infamous sequence, there is one detail that you might have overlooked. And that is of course the relation to the whole thing by Lance's wife, Jodie. In the scene, she can't wait to see Vincent drive the needle into Mia's chest, which is rather a far cry from her initial reaction to the ODing woman being dragged into her house. The answer to why she suddenly gets so excited by all of these actions, however, actually refers back to a previous conversation that she has in this sequence. And that's because while some of us may shudder at the thought, Jodie actually loves needles, and she explains that she's had 16 piercings in her life so far, and maybe even gets off on it. So seeing this event play out is kind of like Jodie's fantasy being turned up to 11. Number 15, Marcellus was staking out Butch's apartment. After killing Vincent, Butch's day goes bad from worse when he hops in a car and immediately runs into the man who wants his head, Marcellus Wallace. This may seem like a really weird coincidence, however, it is a little bit more than that, because Marcellus was actually carrying coffee and donuts when he is seen, so it seems like he was actually there surveilling Butch's apartment along with Vincent. As the latter went into the apartment to use the bathroom, he must have popped out to grab them breakfast and then came out and caught Butch in the crossfire. This coincidence was always easily explained, but with this in mind, it actually makes perfect sense. Number 14, in-universe product placement. Most blockbuster movies feature product placement in some way, shape or form, but Quentin Tarantino has always tried to make this his own by including his own in-universe brands across his different films. For instance, in the opening scene of Pulp Fiction, Pumpkin lights up a red apple cigarette, the very same brand that Butch buys after his meeting with Marcellus. Mia also smokes these in Jack Rabbit Slims, and they're featured again in the likes of From Dusk Till Dawn, Four Rooms, Kill Bill, The Hateful Eight, and of course, Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. Similarly, when Jules and Vincent go to pay Brett a visit, they're eating Big Kahuna Burger for breakfast. Again, this brand can also be seen in Reservoir Dogs, Four Room, From Dusk Till Dawn, and Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. Number 13, Vincent's opening scene appearance. Pulp Fiction's cold open with Pumpkin and Honey Bunny deciding to rob the very diner that they're in is of course one of the most fantastic and most iconic scenes in the whole film, but initially it kinda seems disconnected from the rest of the story. That is until the very end when it finally comes back round into play and interconnects with the other main characters that we've seen across the story. However, in the background of Pumpkin and Honey Bunny's conversation, at one point behind the latter, you can actually see a man with long black hair wearing a white t-shirt walk past, and this is in the very first scene. Of course, this just so happens to be Vincent before he's formally introduced in the movie, who is just at this point looking like an extra, a silhouette in the background. Number 12, Steve Buscemi's cameo. Both Tim Roth and Harvey Keitel appeared in Pulp Fiction and Reservoir Dogs, but there is another returning actor from Dogs who makes their way over to Pulp Fiction, albeit in a much more minor way. And that's because there is a blink and you'll miss it cameo appearance from Mr. Pink in Tarantino's second movie. This comes about in Jack Rabbit Slims as Steve Buscemi played the not-so-great Buddy Holly impersonator who waited on Mia and Vincent. While Buscemi is usually instantly recognizable, he was just reserved enough as the downtrodden diner worker that he didn't exactly jump off the screen and announce himself at the time, and as a result, even die-hard fans managed to miss this cameo. I know I certainly did. Number 11, laughing at Mia's joke. Before Vincent takes Mia out for dinner, he kinda concocts a plan and says that all he's going to do is sit opposite her, chew with his mouth closed, laugh at his jokes, and then take her home. While this initially just seems like a throwaway gag, this does actually have some further significance. See, in Mia's failed pilot, Fox Force 5, the plan was for her to tell a corny joke in every episode, but as it never got picked up, she actually only ever had one in her arsenal. She was too shy to say this joke straight away, but after everything that she and Vincent went through across the course of the night, she eventually does break down and tell Vincent the corny joke at the end of this sequence. And the joke itself was truly terrible, but Vincent does manage to squeak out the tiniest of pathetic laughs in response. So in a way, his plan to simply laugh at her jokes all night kinda did come true in the end. Number 10, Fox Force 5 may have influenced Kill Bill. Now this might be a strange one to wrap your head around, but in the Tarantino universe, the likes of Kill Bill and From Dusk Till Dawn, the genre pictures that Quentin Tarantino has made, actually exist within the universe of movies like Pulp Fiction and Reservoir Dogs as actual movies. So what I mean by that is the characters in Pulp Fiction could go to the cinema and theoretically be there to watch Kill Bill. So since Uma Thurman has actually appeared in both of these universes, the idea has been floated that she might actually just be playing Mia Wallace in both Kill Bill and in Pulp Fiction. Of course, we know that she plays Mia in Pulp Fiction, but if Kill Bill is a movie in the Pulp Fiction story, then the suggestion is that Mia might be the star who plays the bride, and this could even have been inspired in a way by the failed Fox Force 5 pilot that she was famous for. As Mia explains in the film, her character was Raven McCoy, 1/5 of the titular team of deadly secret agents, and claimed to be the deadliest woman in the world with a knife. And if you swap the knives for swords and swap out the corny jokes for a boatload of gore, you might just have the plot of Kill Bill there. Number 9, Marcellus's plaster, or Band-Aid if you're in the US. There are several mysteries surrounding Marcellus as a character that appear in the movie. However, a very minor one of these is just what the hell happened to the back of his head. See, the first fans see of Mia Wallace's husband is via a shot that just puts the back of his head in the frame, and he's wearing a big plaster over his noggin. The truth of why this detail was included in the movie, though, doesn't have anything to do with an in-narrative mystery. It's the simple fact that actor Ving Rhames had hurt his head and needed a plaster over the back of it before shooting the movie. He simply cut his head while shaving, and Quentin Tarantino thought it looked cool, so they were like, yeah, we'll put this square in the film and we'll do a big close-up on it. Number 8, Ezekiel 25:17 isn't actually accurate. One of Pulp Fiction's most iconic quotes is of course the passage linked to Ezekiel 25:17, a supposed Bible verse. Generally, whenever Jules says this passage out loud, it kind of means that someone is about to die, and these words also greatly inform who Jules is as a character. However, while Ezekiel 25:17 is a real verse in the Bible and is similar to Jules's words, the majority of the passage was very much original writing, created to make the exact impact that it did within the movie. Number 7, Danny DeVito is an executive producer. When you hear the title Pulp Fiction, a few names probably spring to mind. Obviously, you got Quentin Tarantino, you got Uma Thurman, you got Samuel L. Jackson, you got Phil LaMarr, you've got Tim Roth, you've got a whole host of people that are inextricably tied to this film. However, one name that probably doesn't instantly spring to mind is Danny DeVito, but he absolutely should when you're talking about this film in the future. And that's because Danny DeVito owned a production company back in the early 90s, and after receiving the stunning script from Tarantino, he passed it immediately on to Miramax, and the rest, as they say, is history. He got a producing credit, and now is tied to this movie forever, as he had an instrumental part in getting it made in the first place. Who'd have thought? Number 6, related characters. In Pulp Fiction alone, there are several characters who are related to other characters from other Quentin Tarantino movies. Some of these are pretty blatant and you probably know a couple already, but there are others that are quite subtle. Take Christopher Walken's superstar Cameo, for instance. He's in the movie as a man who gives Butch his father's watch. He, however, can be traced back to a character who only appeared in Django Unchained in print, that being his great-great-grandfather, Crazy Craig. The more obvious connections between the Tarantino universes, though, actually start with Jimmy Dimmick, played by Quentin Tarantino himself in Pulp Fiction. He is brothers with Larry Dimmick from Reservoir Dogs, who is better known as Mr. White. There are two more brothers between Reservoir Dogs and Pulp Fiction as well, those of course being Vic Vega and Vincent Vega. Number 5, when people get scared, that's when people accidentally get shot. If you take the statement of this title and replace people with an expletive that Samuel L. Jackson is more well known for, you get exactly what his character Jules said to Pumpkin and Honey Bunny when he was warning them in the diner scene. When people get scared, that's exactly when people accidentally get shot. Of course, there is another character by this point in the movie that we have seen accidentally get shot, and he just so happens to be sitting in the back of Jules's car. Of course, we're talking about Marvin, who gets shot in the face by Vincent for seemingly no reason. As I mentioned, there was no real reason for why Vincent shot Marvin in the face in this scene. However, if we think back to Jules's words, they could be implying that in this scene, Vincent was actually scared. But why would he be scared? Well, at this point, Jules was absolutely certain that he had just witnessed a miracle, as 4 bullets that should have killed him completely missed. Vincent is absolutely adamant that he's wrong, but maybe by this point in the car, he's starting to think about the scenario and maybe getting a little scared that Jules might have been right with what he was saying. This is a little bit of a stretch, but it does seem like too much of a coincidence for Jules to mention someone getting accidentally shot so soon after Vincent did that to poor old Marvin, so maybe there is a connection here. Number 4, Butch keyed Vincent's car. While buying drugs from Lance, Vincent complains that someone had just keyed his car and that it would almost be worth it if he could have caught them in the act. After this scene though, the detail isn't mentioned again, and Vincent, just like viewers, is left to wonder who the culprit actually was. Was it someone random, or was it someone else that we've seen in the film? Well, you can probably tell where I'm going by this. Of course, there have been many theories over the year, one of which has actually since been confirmed by Quentin Tarantino, which is the fact that Butch was the man who keyed Vincent's car. So yeah, there was a connection that was explained off screen. Number 3, Mia and Vincent actually stole their dance trophy. Arguably the most iconic scene in a bunch of iconic scenes that litter Pulp Fiction's runtime is of course when Mia Wallace drags Vincent to Jack Rabbit Slim's and convinces him to take part in the dance tournament that's taking place there. I know it's not called a dance tournament and it's called a dance competition, but tournament sounds cooler. It's like Dragon Ball Z or something. Or maybe that's lamer, I don't know. However, that's not the point. The point is, did you know that they didn't actually win this competition and that they stole the trophy instead? This is actually confirmed when Butch is heading to his apartment to retrieve his watch and walks past a house with the radio on. The news report confirms that the trophy that they're seen holding was actually stolen from Jack Rabbit Slim's. Number 2, the inevitable foot shot. Aside from everything else that Quentin Tarantino is known for in his films, you can't escape his association with the amount of feet shots that he puts in his movies, and Pulp Fiction is no different. However, there is one that you might not have noticed in the moment, but upon rewatching, it's just so incredulous that you can't believe that he included it. And that's because the last one of these comes when Esmeralda's bare foot is shown pressing down on the accelerator as she takes Butch away from his big prize fight. Quite why the cab driver isn't wearing any shoes in this scene though is never explained in the context of the film. Number 1, Vincent and Jules should have realized there was someone else hiding in the apartment. As Vincent and Jules are taking their weapons out the trunk of their car, of course wishing they were shotguns at the beginning of the movie, they do a quick roundup of what they know about the job ahead. Specifically, they do a body count of what they're expecting in the apartment when they bust in. According to their intel, there should be 4 or 5 people in the apartment, and that is established pretty soundly across this scene. 4 or 5 people, no more, no less. So, when they go to the apartment and they only see 3 people, they should have had alarm bells ringing. They go over the plan. They've just announced how many people they're expecting, so when they go into the room and they're a man or even 2 short, they should probably check all of the rooms to make sure that there isn't 1 or 2 of them hiding. It's one of those details that you might not even notice because you're just swept up in the action that's going on, but once you do notice it, it's like, guys, you should be better hitmen than this. Kill Bill Volume 1. Number 20, Vanita's Kaboom cereal box. The bride's first pound of vengeful flesh that she extracts comes at the beginning of the film when she kills Vanita Green, aka Copperhead, in her own kitchen. But during a mid-fight breather, Green actually attempts to get the upper hand on the bride by pulling a concealed gun out of a cereal box. Now, at a cursory glance, this might look like the most ordinary cereal box design ever, yet the Kaboom branding is very clearly intentional. Particularly that it foreshadows that there's something very dangerous and explosive inside the box, and hell, the box itself even knowingly says surprise inside, but well, it ain't no prize, is it? It's a gun. Number 19, the bride reads her own palms. Now this one might seem obvious at first glance, but it's really easily missed if you're not paying attention, which admittedly, I very rarely am. Now, after the bride wakes up, she comments that she's been unconscious for 4 years, despite seemingly having no visual reference for how much time has passed. Yet, the bride is staring at her own hands when she says this, and Tarantino even cuts to a close-up to accentuate the point. That being, of course, that the bride is using palmistry to read her palms and deduce just how much time has actually passed since she went into the coma. Number 18. Kiddo is subtitled in lowercase. Now, it isn't until Kill Bill Volume 2 that we learn that the bride's real name is Beatrix Kiddo, with all references to her name in dialogue being bleeped out in Volume 1. Amusingly though, if you watch Volume 1 with the subtitles on, whenever Bill refers to the bride as Kiddo, as in, you know, her actual surname, it's actually subtitled in lowercase. This, of course, is to preserve the surprise of her name reveal and persuade the audience that he's simply referring to her through a term of endearment. In Volume 2, however, once the surprise has been dropped, the subtitles for Kiddo are now in uppercase because, well, the cat's out the bag, and we know that's in fact her real name. Number 17, planes have katana holders in this universe. Now, Quentin Tarantino's films often suggest that they exist within a universe that's just subtly different from our own. After all, Once Upon a Time in Hollywood is based on real historical events, but the details have been changed. Now, this is kind of weirder in Kill Bill Volume 1, which has one strange change when it comes to planes in particular. See, at one point we briefly see the bride on the plane where she's clearly been permitted to take her samurai sword on board. And when making her return trip at the end of the film, we get a wider shot of the plane, which shows there's even bespoke sword holders next to each chair, suggesting that this is a most common occurrence on most flights. It's a hilarious flourish to say the least. Number 16, the heart rate monitor is stuck on the number 69. Tarantino isn't afraid to throw in a juvenile joke or 10 here and there across his movies, and if you keep your eyes peeled during the moment where Elle Driver comes to finish off a comatose the bride while she's in hospital, keep an eye on the heart monitor throughout this entire sequence, and you'll notice something a little bit peculiar. And that's because throughout the scene, the monitor maintains the number 69, and given the obvious sexual implications of that number, it is tough to believe that Tarantino or somebody within the production didn't do it deliberately. Hell, he might not have even noticed until he got to cut the movie, but come on, that's gotta be deliberate, right? Number 15, that True Romance Easter egg. Now, if you're a long-time Quentin Tarantino fan, you might have thought that the sunglasses that the bride steals from Buck early on in the movie look a little bit familiar. And it turns out they absolutely are, because they're modelled after the incredibly similar sunglasses worn by Christian Slater's protagonist Clarence in True Romance. Now, although Quentin Tarantino penned the script for this movie, he didn't actually direct it, and over the years has expressed his mixed feelings on the film as a whole, but still, it's clear that he has a fondness for this protagonist and brought the prop over. Number 14, Tanaka keeps looking up even after he's decapitated. We get a gloriously ultra-violent introduction to O-Ren Ishii, aka Cottonmouth, when she brutally kills the boss Tanaka. Now, this entire sequence is so insane that you might have missed the anatomical mistake when Ishii holds up the head of her victim. See, in the movie, his eyes are still looking upwards, as they would have when Ishii was swinging her sword at his head, but if you know much about human physiology, you'll know that his eyes would have quickly relaxed to a neutral position after the decapitation. Now, obviously, Tarantino and his production team will have known that this wasn't anatomically correct, but still, it looks cool, so they probably just chalked it up to the sillier side of this universe. Number 13, the bride intentionally lowers her heart rate at the hospital. Now, back to the hospital for a second, and specifically when Buck enters the room to see the bride again, not knowing that she's actually no longer comatose. Now, we as the audience know that the bride isn't really comatose at this point, and mere seconds before Buck and the trucker enter the room, her heart could be heard skyrocketing in sheer panic. But as she lies back down as the pair enters the room, her heart rate slows all the way back down. The implication then is that one of the bride's special skills involves lowering her heart rate at will, which is pretty handy in situations like this. Number 12, the man in white isn't Bill. The anime sequence depicting O-Ren Ishii's backstory remains one of the most distinctive parts of Kill Bill Volume 1. However, it also includes a scene that many have debated about since the movie released, and that surrounds the identity of the man in the white suit. See, a lot of people think that this guy is supposed to be a younger version of Bill. And while that isn't the case, it also didn't help that at the time, actor David Carradine also suggested that this could be possible, even though Tarantino himself had refuted the idea. So, who is he? Well, in fact, the character goes by the name of Pretty Ricky, and was apparently killed by O-Ren in a longer version of the anime sequence that ultimately and tragically didn't make the cut. Number 11, the bride's name is visible on her boarding pass. Now this one's really great. See, when the bride flies in from Okinawa, we briefly get a glimpse of her boarding pass, and if you pause the movie right here, you actually get the reveal of her name, as it says right there in the document, Beatrix Kiddo. Now this is admittedly incredibly tough to spot in the moment, but if you did manage to notice it, it would have made that 6-month wait to Kill Bill Volume 2 and the reveal of the bride's name all that more sweeter, because you would have had a theory and you would have known when nobody else believed you and nobody else caught that moment. Number 10, Sophie Fatale models Red Apple cigarettes. Right, here's 2 details for the price of 1. When the bride is seen walking through the Tokyo airport, there's a large billboard behind her for Red Apple cigarettes. Now, Red Apple cigarettes themselves are of course a fake brand created by Tarantino himself that have appeared in a whole bunch of his movies so far. And the woman advertising the cigarettes is Julie Dreyfus, who appears in the film as O-Ren Ishii's assistant and Bill's former protege, Sophie Fatale. Now this is such a fleeting, dead ordinary shot that you might not have even registered it, but it does in fact feature these 2 Easter eggs hiding in plain sight. Number 9, the bride's yellow outfit is inspired by Bruce Lee. Now in fairness, if you know your martial arts movie history, then you probably already knew this already, but if you don't or have never seen a Bruce Lee movie, then here's one for you. See, the bride's now iconic yellow and black tracksuit was heavily inspired by a similar looking outfit donned by Bruce Lee in his final film, Game of Death. Tarantino himself, of course, is a noted martial arts movie fan and wanted to pay homage to one of his favourites and one of the icons of the genre with this design choice. Number 8, O-Ren's father was a sergeant major in the US Army. During the anime sequence, the bride informs us that she was born in a US Army base in Japan, though doesn't really offer too many other details about her history. However, if you pay close attention during the scene of her father's murder, we're given occasional glimpses of a badge of his army uniform, which seems to indicate that he held the rank of Sergeant Major in the US Army. Now it's incredibly easy to gloss over all of this, but given that O-Ren's heritage provides an obstacle to her ascendancy in the Tokyo criminal underworld, it certainly provides worthwhile context to both her personal and professional life. Number 7, the special message on the bottom of the bride's shoe. Now who can ever forget the incredible battle in the House of Blue Leaves where the bride battles the entire Crazy 88. Now it's absolutely crammed with iconic moments, but there is one hilarious shot that barely registers to anyone. And it comes right at the start of the fight, where there's this memorable shot of the bride walking towards the stairs from below through the glass floor, which all focuses on her footwear. Yet you probably didn't notice that the bride's shoes have a very special message printed on them. That being a plain "F you" written in hyper-stylized font to the point where you don't even know what it says. It's really cool when you do realise it, and it certainly is a message of intent to everyone she slaughters in the scene. Number 6, the Gogo Yubari Battle Royale reference. O-Ren's schoolgirl bodyguard Gogo Yubari is played by Chiaki Kuriyama, an actress who won the role after Tarantino saw her in the hit Japanese film Battle Royale. Tarantino, who also called Battle Royale the best movie that he'd seen in 20 years, also snuck in another reference to the hit movie in this scene. See, during Gogo's introductory scene, she toys with a drunk Japanese man who's hitting on her, ultimately impaling him with her sword and making a joke about her being the one who's penetrated him. Now this is clearly a nod to the actress's Battle Royale role, where she also plays a schoolgirl who fends off a horny classmate by stabbing him to death with a knife. Number 5, Go Home to Your Mother is a nod to Kurosawa. One of the funniest moments that occurs in Kill Bill Volume 1 comes when the bride is facing off against a particularly young member of the Crazy 88. In this scene, rather than taking his life, she cuts his sword down to size, spanks him on the bum with her own sword, and tells him, "Go home to your mother." And this is actually a reference to the great samurai movie Yojimbo. See, in that film, Ronin protagonist Sanjuro similarly slaughters a gang before sparing a young boy and telling him, you guessed it, go home to your mother and live a long life eating gruel. Number 4, the bowling pin sound effect. When Gogo gets knocked over in the epic battle between her and the bride, she gets hit in the head with her own meteor hammer and then she goes crashing through a table. Listen closely though, and there's a uniquely goofy flourish in the sound design. That being the sound of bowling pins getting knocked over at this exact moment. Now granted, the sound design in this entire sequence is kinda silly, but still, this is a particularly goofy moment as I mentioned, though it is still very cool. Number 3, Tarantino cameos as one of the Crazy 88. Now, Quentin Tarantino hasn't shied away from cameoing in his own movies, even if there are some fans who probably wish that he hadn't at some points, looking at you, Django Unchained. However, his cameo, or at least his alleged cameo in Kill Bill Volume 1, is apparently uncredited. That's because people swear blind that he definitely appears as one member of the Crazy 88. See, some suggest that he plays one of the assassins who gets their throat slit by the bride immediately after she plucks out one of the 88's eyeballs, while others claim that he plays the 88 member seen stumbling around in the background near the end of the battle. So the thing is, it kinda seems pretty definitive that he is in there somewhere, just people can't exactly pinpoint which of the members he plays. Number 2, Gogo's blood-stained Nike logo. Now, of course, as we all know if we've seen the movie, the bride manages to defeat Gogo by smashing in her foot with a chair leg that has a spike on the bottom, and then smacking her in the head with it. However, if you look closely when Gogo is shown collapsing to the floor in her death, her bloodstained shoes are now almost entirely red, save for the distinctive Nike tick that's hilariously somehow unblemished by the gore. Now you might just assume that Gogo is wearing a pair of red Nikes in this scene, but it's actually established earlier that she's wearing a pair of white ones. Canonically then, you're left to believe that the blood just didn't cover this tick because it was too concerned about the sweet, sweet product placement. And you know what? I like that headcanon. I like that the Nike symbol is just so iconic that the blood's like, nah man, we can't cover that stuff up, it looks too good. And yeah, I know I've done this entire entry referring to the brand as Nike, and I know that every American in the comments and beyond is going to absolutely slate me for not referring to it as Nike, but what can I say? I'm from the UK. Cut me some slack. Number 1, O-Ren foreshadows her own demise. Right at the start of the bride's final battle with O-Ren tells her that you won't last 5 minutes, which is acutely prophetic when we look at the scene as a whole. And that's because from the moment that O-Ren draws her sword to the moment that the bride delivers the final killing blow, a total of 4 minutes and 43 seconds have passed. So it turns out that it was the villain herself who couldn't last 5 minutes with the bride, which just makes this death even sweeter. Kill Bill Volume 2. Number 20, Bill's jacket frames his role in the film. Near the start of the film, we witness the flashback of Bill arriving at the bride/Beatrix's wedding rehearsal, and in this scene, note that he unbuttons his jacket in the seconds before the deadly Viper assassination squad enters the chapel and massacres everyone. And that's because this is actually mirrored right at the end of the film as well. In particular, after Beatrix defeats Bill with the 5-point palm exploding heart technique, he buttons up the same jacket before taking his fateful 5 steps. In the first shot, Beatrix is walking away from Bill to her husband-to-be, and in the last shot, Bill is walking away from the bride to his death. Number 19, Bud has the same gasoline can as Reservoir Dogs' Mr. Blonde. Keep a close eye on the interior of Bud's trailer and you might notice a distinctive Safeguard gasoline can laying around. Now if the prop looks a little bit familiar, that's because it's actually already been used in a Quentin Tarantino movie before, particularly in Reservoir Dogs by Mr. Blonde. This occurs in the iconic scene where he douses kidnapped cop Marvin Nash with it while torturing him. And funnily enough, it can also be seen in Pulp Fiction as well, where it's used to dispose of the remains of another Marvin. Number 18, Paula Schultz's corpse makes bunny ears. After Bud subdues Beatrix, he buries her in the grave of another woman called Paula Schultz. But if you look closely after he's dug the poor woman in question up, you can actually see her corpse laying in her coffin on the right hand side of the screen. More to the point, look closely at Paula's fingers and she's actually making bunny ears, which are casting a weird little shadow on the back of the coffin. Now obviously rigor mortis plays a part here as it stiffens a person's extremities after death, but think about it, what sicko posed her in that way? We're asking the important questions here naturally. Number 17, Beatrix never speaks to Bud. Though Beatrix, of course, has significant interactions with all members of the deadly Viper assassination squad throughout the 2 films, she never actually speaks to Bud. The two never cross paths in the first film, of course, and when she tries to kill him in the second, he quickly incapacitates her. And even when she does regain consciousness, she remains totally silent, only ever nodding at Bud and towards his flashlight. Of course, when she eventually escapes and returns to the trailer, Bud has already been killed, killed, and she doesn't have to do it herself. Number 16, the meaning behind Bill's car. Early in the film, when Bill pays a visit to see Bud in his trailer, we can actually see the character's car parked nearby. The camera lingers on the car, and it was chosen for good reason. It's a Di Tommaso Mangusta, with Mangusta meaning mongoose in Italian. And what are mongooses best known for? Well, it just so happens to be killing snakes. And of course, given that Beatrix is a former member of the Divas with the codename Black Mamba, it's all too fitting that Bill is driving a mongoose. Number 15, half of the Divas aren't even named after vipers. We all know the old saying, if you dance with the snakes in the snake pit, you're gonna get slithered on. Well, unlike the person that quote originated from, it turns out that half of the Divas aren't even named after vipers. Bill, for starters, has the humanoid codename as Snake Charmer, while Beatrix's Black Mamba actually belongs to the Elapidae family, and Elle Driver's California Mountain Snake is totally non-venomous and therefore not a viper. This leaves the only true vipers among the group as Bud's Sidewinder, already she's Cottonmouth, and Vanita Green's Copperhead. Number 14, Tarantino's Honda Civic makes an appearance. Quentin Tarantino's first car was reportedly a 1981 Honda Civic, which could explain why that same model of car has appeared in 3 of his movies so far. It made its first and most prominent appearance in Pulp Fiction, when Butch ran over Marcellus with it, and the very same white Honda was then driven by the title character in Jackie Brown. And finally, in Kill Bill Volume 2, the car could be seen parked outside the strip club. So, if Tarantino's next film is set in the present day, or at least close to it, let's hope this convention comes back. I love this little cameo. Number 13, Elle's eye removal is foreshadowed. Now here's one that seems blindingly obvious, in retrospect. The story's 9th chapter, where Beatrix has her fateful battle with Elle, is knowingly titled Elle and I, which seems like a fitting enough name given their established storied history. But given that the chapter also sees Beatrix rip Elle's eye out, there's certainly more to it to that. It is probably a little wink to the action as much as it is their history. Number 12, Michael Parks has a double role. Now you might not have realised that the retired pimp Esteban is actually played in this movie by the legendary character actor Michael Parks. Now, while that revelation alone might be surprising to some, the most interesting part is that Parks himself has, of course, already appeared in a Kill Bill movie, showing up in Volume 1 as a totally different character, Texas Ranger Earl McGraw. And he won this second role through pure happenstance. See, the great Ricardo Montalban was originally hired to play Esteban, but when he couldn't attend a read-through of the script during pre-production, Parks agreed to read in his place. Ultimately, Tarantino realized that he actually preferred Parks' performance and hired him in the role instead. Number 11, the Pai Mei unknowingly gets revenge against Elle. During Beatrix's fight with Elle, Elle reveals that she killed their joint master, the Pai Mei. Beatrix responds, of course, like I said, by ripping out Elle's eye, but there's a little bit more subtext going on in this scene. And that's because you might notice that she rips Elle's remaining eye out with her right hand. And that's significant if you paid attention to a prior flashback, which reveals there's actually a secret significance in Beatrix's act. See, during the flashback where the Pai Mei is training a younger Beatrix, he defeats her and, while twisting her right arm in place, informs her, "It's my arm now, I can do what I please." So, with that logic, the Pai Mei actually kinda indirectly did get his revenge on Elle. How? Well, Beatrix used her right arm, the arm that the Pai Mei owns, in order to finish the character off. So, with this in mind, he owned the arm got the finishing blow, so he gets the credit. That's probably logic any boss in the world can understand. Number 10, the visible boomer mic. HD is a blessing and a curse. For viewers, it's great to see your favourite movies in the highest resolution possible, but for filmmakers, it can unearth secrets that were otherwise obscured. Case in point, if you watch the Blu-ray version of this film, eagle-eyed viewers might be able to notice a boom mic scarcely visible when Bud is chatting with Larry. The mic can be seen reflected in Larry's sunglasses, and while it is just a small mistake, it's a mistake nonetheless. Number 9, Daryl Hannah homages her Blade Runner death. After Beatrix removes Elle's other eye, she of course starts squirming around in pain on the floor, as you probably would if you just had your eye ripped out by somebody's hand. But while that might not be surprising, look at the very specific way that she moves on the floor, as it might actually be a reference to another movie. And that's because Blade Runner fans will surely remember the iconic death scene of Daryl Hannah's own replicant, who similarly spasms around on the floor before finally being retired. Like I said before, this can just be chalked up to a natural reaction to having something so violent happening to you, but the similarity in the movements and the same actor playing both roles does suggest that this might be a more considered homage. Number 8, only 3 people die on screen. It's a pretty natural expectation to go into a Quentin Tarantino movie and expect to see a lot of violence and a lot of killing. And that certainly is the case with Kill Bill Volume 1, which famously has a body count in the dozens. It's a ridiculously violent movie, and the bride kills a lot of people. Kill Bill Volume 2, though, boasts a body count just a fraction of its predecessor. In fact, only 3 characters are killed on screen in Volume 2, Bud, Bill, and the Pai Mei in a flashback. And more to the point, Beatrix only kills a single person, Bill, in Volume 2. Similarly, Bill himself isn't actually shown killing anyone, despite us being told just how dangerous and how much of a bloodthirsty killer this man can be. Number 7, Bibi shooting her mother is foreshadowed. When Beatrix finally finds Bill's hotel room, she's shocked to know that their daughter Bibi is actually alive. In fact, her kid points a toy gun at her and shouts "bang bang." And this reveal is actually neatly foreshadowed at the very start of the first Kill Bill, when Nancy Sinatra's iconic "Bang Bang, My Baby Shot Me Down" memorably plays over the opening credits. Now indeed, this title and those lyrics is literally what happens in this scene, and that can't be a coincidence. Number 6, the credits confirm Elle's ambiguous fate. Years before the Marvel Cinematic Universe had us sitting through lengthy credits just to catch a glimpse of the next movie or an Easter egg from the movie we just watched, Kill Bill Volume 2 had an incredibly opulent end credit sequence of its own. And after the first batch are done, Tarantino cuts to a shot of Beatrix driving her car in black and white, while a roll call appears on the screen for the various members of the Divas, whose names are then promptly crossed out per their deaths. But when Daryl Hannah's name pops up, the strike-through is actually removed and replaced by a question mark, hinting that her character might have survived because, after all, we don't actually see her die on screen. It's implied and she's in a lot of pain, but it's never confirmed, and these credits seemingly indicate that there's more to that character's story. So if Kill Bill 3 ever happens, it's probably likely that Tarantino will wrap up the character's fate in one way or another. Number 5, Bill's TV is synchronized to what he's doing. During the final confrontation between Bill and Beatrix, pay close attention to the moment when Bill sheathes his Hanzo sword and then puts it down on the top. And that's because on the right hand side of the screen, a film is playing on the TV, the 1949 Roy Rogers western The Golden Stallion, and as Beatrix descends the stairs, Bill slams the sheathed sword onto the worktop just as the character in the film is punched square in the face. The sound of the sheath hitting the top and the punch match up so perfectly that this can't have been a coincidence. Number 4, Bill and Beatrix equals Bibi. Now this is a detail that seems incredibly obvious, but is similarly incredibly easy to miss. So, we know that Beatrix and Bill's daughter is identified in the film only as Bibi. We're never told what those initials mean, but by anyone's guess, you can probably assume that it stands for Beatrix and Bill, the child's parents. Contextually, Bill may have chosen the name as a secret tribute to his lover, no matter that he ordered her death and indeed believed her to be dead. Number 3, Bill's Reservoir Dogs reference. Now, the safeguard canister isn't the only reference to Reservoir Dogs in Kill Bill Volume 2. In fact, during the final showdown, Bill pulls out a gun and points it at Beatrix before telling her, "If you don't settle down, I'm gonna have to put one in your kneecap." And I hear that's a very painful place to get shot in. Now, this line is actually a wink and a nod to Tarantino's debut. And that's because there, Mr. Blonde similarly tells a wounded Mr. Orange in the film's climax, quote, "Along with the kneecap, the gut is the most painful area a guy can get shot in." So yeah, I guess Bill's as much of a Tarantino fan as we are. Number 2, the debate over how many steps Bill takes. Beatrix and Bill have a surprisingly brief final fight. It of course wraps up when Beatrix hits Bill with the 5-point palm exploding heart technique, meaning Bill will drop dead as soon as he takes 5 more steps. And so, Bill then dies after standing up, buttoning up his jacket, and taking those 5 steps until he dies. But the scene immediately kicked off an argument between fans over just how many steps Bill actually takes in this scene. Though the legend dictates that it's 5, many believe that Bill actually makes it 6 steps before kneeling over. It basically comes down to whether or not you believe that him changing his stance before walking counts as a step. To these 6-step truthers, it might suggest that Bill was just so hard that he managed to resist the 5-point palm exploding heart technique for an additional step. Others, though, simply view it as reading too much into the scene, and that he took the 5 steps and him adjusting himself and standing up, that doesn't count. Number 1, the post-credits gag. Those precious few who managed to sit through the entire credit sequence of Kill Bill Volume 2 were treated with a pretty cool gag, that being an unused take from Volume 1's most iconic action scene. The 10-second clip is an extended take of Beatrix ripping out one of the Crazy 88's eyes during the showdown at the House of the Blue Leaves. We're able to see the clapperboard prior to Tarantino calling action, and then Uma Thurman laughing after he calls cut while asking him to do another take. So yeah, it doesn't add anything to the plot, but it is a fun little reward for the people who managed to sit through the entire credits, or more likely, just skip to the end in Inglourious Basterds. Number 20, the opening title is scanned from Tarantino's script. You might recall that Inglourious Basterds' title card isn't so much a logo as it is handwritten scrawl. However, this is more than just a playful flourish on Tarantino's part, as this is actually the director's own handwriting. More to the point, it's actually the exact handwritten text that appeared on the filmmaker's own script of the movie that was taken and scanned and then transplanted straight into the film itself. 19. Hans Landa only greets the Lapidie daughter with Aryan features. In the movie's unforgettable opening scene, Colonel Hans Landa pays a visit to Perrier Lapidie's farm. And upon entering his abode, he finds Lapidie's 3 daughters all lined up. Now, in the scene, Landa's eyes are immediately drawn to daughter Charlotte, but you might not have really noticed why. Well, it's because Charlotte is the only one of the 3 to have blonde hair and blue eyes, the distinct Aryan features, while Charlotte's sisters both have dark hair and brown eyes, which seemingly wouldn't interest Landa all that much, given, he's like one of the biggest Nazis. Number 18, the weirdly inconsistent subtitles. Tarantino's film, of course, features a plethora of non-English dialogue spoken throughout the film, and as such, requires subtitles to understand. However, the manner in which these subtitles are actually used within the film itself is kinda strangely inconsistent. For starters, in the opening farm scene, the subtitles will seemingly choose on a whim whether or not to translate the conversational language that is being spoken. For example, at one point merci is simply translated as merci, but when Landa praises the father for his milk and family, the return merci is then translated as thank you in the subtitles. Landa saying we also isn't translated to yes in the subtitles either, for seemingly no reason. It has been suggested that Tarantino left in these mistakes as a kind of homage to the rough and ready spaghetti westerns that inspired so much of his career, but that might be giving the man too much credit. Who knows? Number 17. Aldo Rain only kills 1 person in the entire movie. Though he seems like a pretty deadly kind of guy by his look and demeanor and reputation, we actually only see Lieutenant Aldo Rain kill a single person in the whole movie. In the final scene, when Landa surrenders himself to the bastards alongside his radio operator Herman, Rain promptly pulls a gun and then shoots Herman dead. And while Rain certainly commands a whole bunch of Nazi slaughter and scalping throughout the film, this is the only time he gets his hands directly dirty and kills someone directly. Number 16, Landa slyly checks one of the Lapidie girls' pulses. Back to the opening scene now, when Hans Landa sits down and one of the Lapidie daughters, Suzanne, walks by him. At this moment, he grabs her wrist and then asks if she would accommodate him by pouring him a glass of milk. Also, I'm not the first one to make this observation or anything like that, but why are so many villains in movies always drinking milk? Anyway, pay close attention to Landa in this scene, and you'll actually notice that he grabs Suzanne's wrist in order to slyly take her pulse and determine whether or not she might be lying. Now, to be fair, hiding something or not, pretty much everyone would have a raised pulse in a scenario like this, but still, it goes a long way to showing just how many tools Hans Landa has in his tool shed in order to get what he wants. That was kind of a phrase, and I'm not going to do it again, so that's what we're going with. Number 15, Quentin Tarantino has 2 cameos in the film. It's not unusual for Tarantino to put himself in his own movies as a cameo or even a significant part. However, this time around in Inglourious Basterds, he actually plays 2 different roles. First up, he plays a dead Nazi who gets scalped by one of the bastards during their introductory sequence, and secondly, he provides the voice for an American soldier during the premiere of the Nazi propaganda film Nation's Pride. In the latter case, he can be heard saying, "I implore you, we must destroy that tower," in an exaggerated southern accent that I'm not even going to attempt here. Number 14. The names of Jewish people are written on Donnie's baseball bat. Now this one's much easier to spot if you've seen the recent 4K restoration. Now we know that Donnie the Bear Jew Donowitz uses his trusty baseball bat to bash in the faces of Nazis, but did you know that there's actually a bunch of names written on this item? As a scrapped scene from Tarantino's original script reveals, Donnie bought the baseball bat before shipping off to war and then asked everyone in his Jewish Boston neighborhood to sign the names of their loved ones who might be in danger. The establishing scene reportedly featured in a version of the film that was initially shown at Cannes Film Festival, but sadly we haven't seen it on any home video releases since, which is such a shame. Number 13, Aldo Rain's neck scar is from surviving a lynching. Now there is enough going on in this behemoth of a movie that you might have not noticed the kind of prominent scar that's on Lieutenant Aldo Rain's neck. And those of you who did notice probably just assumed that it was the result of Aldo having his throat sliced open and somehow surviving. But if you look closely at the wound, you'll note that it's not from a knife, but rather from a severe rope burn. Better still, Tarantino's original script actually described what caused it, saying, quote, "Lieutenant Aldo has one defining physical characteristic, a rope burn around his neck, as if once upon a time he survived a lynching and the scar will never once be mentioned," end quote. Number 12, Highcox uses pop culture to fill his knowledge gaps. British Commander Lieutenant Archie Highcox poses as an undercover Nazi while in German-occupied France. Yet, despite his dedication to the role and his aptitude for speaking German, he's eventually undone by a misunderstanding of German social mores. However, this is basically foreshadowed earlier on in the movie, where the lieutenant, a former film critic, uses pop culture references to paper over his gaps in German knowledge. For instance, Highcox tells the general that he speaks German, quote, "like a Katzenjammer Kid," but the Katzenjammer Kids was actually an American comic strip in which characters spoke in stereotypically German accented English, which really isn't much good at all if you're trying to pose as a Nazi in Nazi territory. Number 11, Sam Levine has a secret second role. Freaks and Geeks star Sam Levine plays one of the lesser bastards in the movie, and his inclusion in the film at all is apparently down to Tarantino's own fandom for the aforementioned TV show. Yet the actor has a secret second role in the film, which is becoming a common theme in this list that you'll only notice if you have the eyes of a hawk. That's because during Hitler's introductory scene when he learns of the bastards' most recent rampage, a man can be seen painting his portrait in the background, and indeed, that's Levine himself, concealed beneath a fake beard and mustache. And yeah, while I probably could have just made this up, this was indeed confirmed on Twitter a few years ago. Number 10, Bridget von Hammersmark realizes Highcox's big mistake. Lieutenant Highcox's German disguise is ultimately rumbled when Nazi officer Hellstrom notices that he uses the wrong fingers when asking for 3 drinks. In the scene, the fake Nazi throws up his middle, ring, and index fingers when asking for the drinks, when a German would actually use their thumb, middle, and index finger. Like this. What you probably didn't realize though is at the moment that the character puts his fingers up, is that Bridget von Hammersmark actually notices his error and her eyes widen with horrified realization for just a brief second. Number 9, the yellow leaf on Corporal Wiki's chest represents the Star of David. During Donnie's iconic introductory scene, a leaf falls on Corporal Wiki's jacket and stays there for the rest of the sequence. Though this was seemingly a happy accident on the day, some have noted the leaf's resemblance to the Star of David patch that the Nazis forced Jewish people to wear as a means of identification. And in the event that you think we might be thinking too much into this, Eli Roth did confirm the story in a subsequent interview. He said, quote, "There's another scene when a soldier is pointing at a map and a yellow leaf falls on actor Gideon Buckhart's chest. And someone else pointed out that it's, quote, down to the yellow leaf that mimics the Star of David on that soldier, and Quentin kept that, and he kept it for a reason," end quote. Number 8, Lander smokes the same pipe as Sherlock Holmes. Now you'll probably remember that in the farmhouse scene that we've talked about so much today, Hans Lander pulls out a comically oversized pipe while he's interrogating his subjects. Now aside from being a cute sight gag in an otherwise incredibly menacing scene, it should be noted that this is the exact kind of pipe smoked by Sherlock Holmes himself in the many adaptations of Arthur Conan Doyle's series. And given that Lander is essentially working as a detective while he's at the farm, this is just another cruel joke on his part. Number 7, the dead dogs in the vet clinic. After the tavern shootout, Bridget von Hammersmark is at a local vet's getting her wounds treated to while she's talking to Lieutenant Aldo Rain about what exactly went wrong. This exchange is intense enough that the audience is typically laser focused on the characters. But if you peek just behind them, you might notice 2 dead dogs in the cages in the background. And the reason for this? Well, Tarantino actually had to cut a scene where the bastards forced the vets to help them by murdering 2 of their dogs right in front of their eyes. So yeah, these guys definitely weren't doing it out of the kindness of their heart, and you'll remember that the next time you watch this movie. Number 6, Lander's strudel looks like a house once he puts a cigarette out in it. Here's something you can miss incredibly easy, yet once you do notice it, you'll never watch this scene or the movie in the same way again. At the end of the incredible, unforgettable scene when Hans Lander dines at a French restaurant and makes the most intense strudel order of all time, he departs by extinguishing his cigarette in the remains of the dessert. It's been suggested by some fans that Tarantino lingers on this rather unflattering final glimpse of the dessert because it now resembles a house, particularly the Lapidite cabin from the start of the film. And given the fact that Lander is sat right next to Shoshana all the way through this scene, this reference is probably on purpose. Of course, this could also be a classic case of people just looking far too deep into this movie in this particular image, but hey, I do like this theory. Number 5, the bastards in Nazi costumes are covered in blood and bullet holes. When Hirschberg, Hugo Stiglitz, and Donowitz pose as Nazi soldiers to ambush 3 incoming Nazis on the forest road, pay close attention to the backs of their jackets. We only see them for a brief second, and the shadows cast across their backs do make it difficult to spot without hitting the pause button, but the jackets actually have splashes of blood and even bullet holes on them. And this is of course because the bastards appropriated these costumes by killing the Nazis who previously owned them. It may seem obvious when you explain it like that, but it's such a small detail and you probably don't notice it because it goes by so quick. Number 4, Brad Pitt does a Marlon Brando impression during the premiere. One of the film's most hilarious sequences, of course, comes near the end, when the group of bastards put on their disguises and infiltrate the premiere of the movie to get close to the Nazi high command. Brad Pitt is definitely the star here, as Aldo awkwardly pretends to be an Italian stuntman named Enzo Golami, and in an apparent attempt to look Italian, he pushes his jaw out in a kind of bizarre way. While it might just seem like a funny thing to do, Brad Pitt was apparently influenced by Marlon Brando in this scene, particularly his role as Don Corleone in the Godfather movie. Just like Brando did, he juts out his face and tenses his jaw muscles to give him that kind of uncanny speech pattern. Number 3, the girls getting Zola's autograph are wearing Hitler Youth uniforms. At the premiere, the camera glides up the stairs as Shoshana walks past Nazi Frederick Zoller, who is signing autographs for a group of 3 fans. Now, while you probably assume that these women are either ambitious female officers or simply some of Zoller's fangirls, it's not that simple. In fact, their distinctive brown jackets instead indicate that they're part of the League of German Girls or Band of German Maidens, the girls' branch of the Hitler Youth. Number 2, Shosanna's death speech is in English for revenge. At the end of the film, the doors to the cinema are locked, trapping all the Nazis inside as a fire starts to rage, and all they have to see is Shosanna's face on the big screen. Now, her speech is actually spoken in English, reportedly as an additional punch to the gut for the Nazis, many of whom wouldn't actually understand what the hell she was saying, much like how Shosanna herself was unable to understand Hans Lander at the start of the film when her family was killed. This was apparently suggested to Tarantino by Shosanna's actress herself, and it makes for a much more powerful sequence. Number 1. Kurt Russell's dying scream from Death Proof is used in the climax. So, at the end of the movie, Shosanna's final plan to execute the Nazis' high command in this fiery inferno does actually succeed. And in one hilarious shot, we get to see a German officer propelled through one of the cinema's windows by a huge explosion, and to make it even better, the officer lets out a ridiculously over-the-top, blood-curdling scream. And if you thought this particular scream did sound a little bit familiar, that's because it's actually ripped directly from Tarantino's previous movie, the Kurt Russell starring Death Proof. In fact, in that movie's finale, Kurt Russell's character lets out the exact same scream, and it was just so good, Tarantino decided to use it twice.
Django Unchained. Number 20, James Remar plays Schultz's first kill and the person who kills him. You may well have noticed that veteran character actor James Remar plays 2 supporting roles in the film. But did you appreciate their fateful significance to Dr. King Schultz? Near the start of the movie, Remar first appears as Ace Speck, Django's owner, who soon enough ends up shot in the head and killed by Schultz. He then reappears later as Butch Pooch, one of Calvin Candy's bodyguards, who ends up shooting Schultz dead immediately after Schultz kills Candy. So, to summarize, Remar ends up playing both Schultz's first kill in the movie and the man who ends up killing him. As for why Tarantino cast the same actor in both roles, well, you'd have to ask him. Number 19, Nash and Coons. When we briefly see the wanted poster for the Smitty Bacall gang, the names of 2 of the gang's members should stand out to fans of Tarantino's filmography: Gerald Nash and Crazy Craig Coons. Given Tarantino's fondness for not so subtly implying a shared universe between his movies, we can safely infer that Nash is likely related to Reservoir Dogs' ill-fated kidnapped policeman Marvin Nash. And as for Coons, well, that one's a little bit easier to remember. It's Vietnam War veteran Captain Coons from Pulp Fiction, played so memorably in a small role by Christopher Walken. While the familial links themselves are vague at best, given that Tarantino imbues all of his movies with an exacting amount of detail, there is no way that these name drops were mere coincidence. Number 18, why there are only 5 bullets in Django's revolver. When Django kills the Brittle brothers, he wipes out Roger Lil Raj Brittle by shooting him dead with his own revolver. Yet you might have noticed that Django only fires 5 bullets, despite the gun being able to hold 6. I mean, being a 6-shooter and all. Well, the reason for this? Single-action revolvers of the era didn't have a transfer bar, meaning that the gun's hammer would be resting on one of the chambers, increasing the risk of an accidental discharge if, say, the gun was dropped or mishandled. By leaving the chamber the hammer rests on empty, that risk was mitigated, even if it meant having 1 less bullet chambered for an engagement. So there you have it. Much as Tarantino is hardly a stickler for historical authenticity, he at least got this detail dead on. Number 17, Tom Savini's cameo. Legendary Hollywood makeup artist Tom Savini, best known for his gory contributions to George A. Romero's classic zombie films, has a brief cameo in the film as one of Candy's slave trackers, whose guard dogs of course brutally maul slave D'Artagnan to death. Savini's character can also be briefly seen later in the movie when Django goes back to save Broomhilda. Savini's involvement was more than mere fan service though. He goes way back with Tarantino, having appeared alongside him in the cult fave vampire film From Dusk Till Dawn, which was also written by Tarantino and directed by their mutual pal Robert Rodriguez. Number 16, Schultz whistles the original Django theme. At the start of the scene where members of the proto-KKK prepare for their raid against Django and Schultz, we briefly see Schultz sticking a hunk of dynamite inside the novelty tooth on top of his wagon cart. While doing so, he whistles a tune, and though this might seem totally inconsequential, it's actually composer Luis Bakalov's theme tune from the original 1966 spaghetti western Django. This wasn't the first time that Tarantino used a whistle to nod to an iconic piece of film music. In Kill Bill Volume 1, he had Elle Driver whistle the title track from Bernard Herrmann's score for Twisted Nerve as she tries in vain to kill the bride. Number 15, Django's first kill and Schultz's last kill mirror each other. In another curious instance of kills throughout the movie mirroring each other, there's an intriguing parallel between Django's first kill and Schultz's last kill. Django's first kill is Big John Brittle, while Schultz's last kill is Calvin Candy. In both instances, the same gun is used, with the victim being surprised by its concealed nature before being shot in the heart, all while blood spills onto a white object on their chest, a piece of paper and a flower, respectively, and they then take a few seconds to fall down dead. In the immortal words of George Lucas, it's like poetry, it rhymes. Number 14, a Klansman falls off their horse. Okay, so here's a really funny one, though considering the dark nature of the scene, you couldn't be blamed at all for missing it. When the Klansmen ride their horses over the hill towards Django and Schultz, look closely at the middle of the screen and you might just notice a rider falling off their horse and getting damn near trampled to death by another. Now, to be clear, you might need to raise the brightness levels on your TV to spot this one, considering the low-key lighting involved. But it absolutely does happen. It doesn't seem to be a planned part of the scene, but then again, it totally works given that the Klansmen are riding with crudely made eyesight-limiting hoods, so. Number 13, it's about a dentist fighting candy. Prepare to have your mind blown, and also hate yourself for not realizing this earlier. Django Unchained is about Dr. King Schultz, a dentist turned bounty hunter, facing off against Calvin Candy, a savage slave owner with bad teeth. So just to be clear, it's a movie about a dentist battling candy. Do you get it? Again, this is one of those glaringly obvious things that hides itself so perfectly in plain sight. Simple wordplay we fail to fully appreciate because we're so wrapped up in the brilliantly written story and characters. Or that's what we're gonna tell ourselves anyway. But if you did manage to catch that one yourself, well done. I applaud you. Number 12, Tarantino's second cameo. For better or worse, everyone remembers Tarantino's late film cameo as a member of the LeQuint Dickey Mining Company. Atrocious Australian accent and all. But he also makes another appearance earlier in the movie in decidedly less conspicuous fashion. When the proto-KKK members are arguing over their poorly made hoods, one of the Klansmen asks a hood-wearing colleague, Robert, how well he can see out of the hood. And this character, whose face is never seen, is voiced by none other than Tarantino himself. Once you know it's him, it's really an easy spot, yet the scene is so awash in various voices of masked individuals that it's incredibly easy to miss otherwise. Number 11, Candy's dinner pretensions. There are several references made to the Candy family's superficially well-to-do nature, that beyond all their riches, they're putting up a pretentious facade to give the impression that they belong in high society. Case in point, at the start of dinner, we see Schultz pour salt on his steak, but refuse an offer of gravy, all while Calvin's sister Lara accepts the gravy. And so in a vapid attempt to appear classy rather than stereotypically southern, when Broomhilda brings the jug of gravy over to his steak, Calvin taps it with his knife, shooing her away and refusing the gravy. Couple this with the fact that Candy, an alleged Francophile, doesn't know the meaning of the word panache, and his highfalutin facade quickly wears very, very thin. Number 10, Django learns from Schultz's gunplay at the end. And one more gunplay-related parallel now. At the start of the movie, when Schultz frees Django, note the extremely slick move where Schultz drops his lantern and immediately pulls out a pistol, allowing him to catch Ace Woody by surprise and blow him the hell away. Django evidently paid very close attention to this sleight of hand, as he does the very same thing right at the end of the movie. As the Candy clan returns to the mansion following Calvin's funeral, they find Django lying in wait, holding a candle in hand. A mere moment later, he drops the candle to the floor and immediately pulls out a gun, similarly allowing him to get the drop on his numerous adversaries. Number 9, the original Django has a cameo. There's no greater tribute to the original Django film than the fact that its star, Franco Nero, has a cameo appearance. Nero plays the small part of an Italian slave owner who goes to the bar following the loss of a Mandingo fight and briefly crosses paths with Jamie Foxx's Django. Tellingly, when Django tells him that the D in his name is silent, he retorts with, "I know." All the same, unless you're a huge fan of spaghetti westerns or familiar with Nero's career, it's incredibly easy to take this cameo at face value and not appreciate what Tarantino's actually nodding to. Fun fact, Nero initially suggested to Tarantino that he should play a mysterious horseman appearing to Django in visions throughout the film, who at the end would be revealed as Django's father, an idea which the filmmaker probably quite sensibly vetoed. Number 8. The red bandana woman is played by Zoe Bell. Late in the film, when Django guns down a room full of trackers, we briefly see that one of them is a woman who wears a red bandana over her face, with Tarantino even lingering on her for a few telling moments. Given that the lower half of her face isn't visible, you'd be forgiven for failing to spot that the tiny role was actually played by Tarantino's regular collaborator Zoe Bell, who has worked as both a stunt double and an actress across the latter half of his filmography. As it turns out, the character was originally intended to have a much larger part in the film, with a backstory and a fight scene, but it was cut due to time constraints during shooting. Bell also revealed that her character wore a bandana to conceal the fact that she's missing her entire jaw, as would have been revealed had Tarantino been given time to shoot the full version of the scene. Number 7. The meaning behind Mr. Candy. As Schultz first heads to meet Candy, he's informed that as a Francophile, Candy prefers to be referred to as Monsieur Candy rather than Mr. Candy. And for all but one of their interactions, Schultz does indeed address Candy per his preferences. This single exception comes in their final scene together, when after the sale of Broomhilda has been completed, Schultz says, "Mr. Candy, normally I would say Auf Wiedersehen. But since what Auf Wiedersehen actually means is till I see you again, and since I never wish to see you again, to you, sir, I say goodbye." At this point, any remaining facade of placating Candy has been totally dropped, extending even to how he addresses him. Number 6. The poker game uses slaves' severed ears as chips. Okay, now this one's really gross, and you might wish that you never knew it. Near the end of the movie, moments before Django kills the trackers who are playing poker, look incredibly closely at the table they're playing on. And you might just notice that they're not playing with typical chips, but rather some strange fleshy objects. As it turns out, they're actually betting with ears. And Tarantino's script goes further to clarify that they're the ears of black slaves. And if that's somehow not horrifying enough, Tarantino adds that those who rewatch the film might even notice that some of the Candyland slaves are missing ears. Good God. Number 5. Django learns from being blinded by blood. It's always satisfying from a film continuity perspective to see characters learn from prior mistakes, even if only in incredibly subtle fashion. And that's absolutely true of Django and his close-range shooting technique. After Schultz's death, Django pulls his gun and shoots Butch Pooch dead, at which point the massive squib of blood squirts in his eyes, blinding him enough that he misses his next shot at another of Candy's goons. Django clearly takes note of his mistake though, as later when he convinces the slaver escorts to free him and hand him a gun, he closes his eyes before opening fire on the two men in front of him, ensuring the blood splatter doesn't blind him. This then allows him to make a bullseye shot at the third escort's dynamite pouch, exploding him instantly. Now that is character development. Number 4. Amber and Russ Tamblin's cameos. Here's a cute duo of cameos that were missed by all but the most eagle-eyed of viewers. Early in the film, as Django and Schultz enter the town of Daughtry, they're eyeballed by the locals, including a young woman looking from a window up high and an older gentleman on the ground. These background artists are in fact actress Amber Tamblyn and her father Russ, the latter having famously starred in the classic 1965 western Son of a Gunfighter. As for how the pair made it into the movie, well, according to Amber herself, Tarantino is a good friend and invited her to do a cameo, at which point she suggested it would be great if she and her father played a father-daughter pair in the movie. And so, in a nod to her father's western past, the duo are credited as son of a gunfighter and daughter of a son of a gunfighter, respectively. Number 3. Django kneecaps Steven for faking his limp. At the very end of the movie, rather than directly kill Calvin's head house slave Steven, Django shoots him in the kneecaps and leaves him helpless to escape as he blows the mansion up. It's a fitting end for Steven, given that moments earlier, he threw his cane aside, implying that he had been faking, or in the very least wildly exaggerating, the extent of his limp. For Django to seriously injure a man who had been falsifying his condition, moments before leaving him to die no less, was the ultimate insult for the last villain standing, or as the case ultimately was, not standing. Number 2, Django steals Candy's clothes at the end. Now, this one should be incredibly obvious, and yet it's bafflingly easy to miss amid the chaos of that incredible final scene. When Django returns to the Candy mansion to mop up the rest of his family and followers, he's actually wearing the very same burgundy suit that Candy was wearing the first time he met Django. Django having presumably raided his closet to put it on. To hammer the point home, Django even says to Steven, "How'd you like my new duds?" You know, before now, I didn't know that burgundy was my color. And yet, it's almost embarrassingly easy to miss this fact, as silly as it might seem in retrospect. Right down to the cigarette extender, he's delivering the final blow to Candy by destroying his home while wearing his own goods. Number 1, there's a post-credits scene. And finally, you probably don't associate Tarantino much with post-credits scenes, given that the guy's movies largely speak for themselves without any last-minute sequel baiting or teases of future attractions. But Django Unchained does in fact feature an incredibly brief post-credits stinger, returning to the scene where Django killed the slavers working for the LaQuint Dickey Mining Company. Django's fellow Mandingo fighters are simply shown looking on at the carnage as one of them asks of Django, "Who was that?" Trust Tarantino of all filmmakers to reward those who stuck around to the end with a totally perfunctory and yet absolutely hilarious final morsel.
The Hateful Eight. Number 20, Django's saddle. We all know that Tarantino loves to reference his prior movies, implying something of a shared universe between them. And with that in mind, keep your eyes on the 3 bounty corpses Samuel Jackson's Major Marquis Warren has in his possession at the start of the movie. The saddle resting on top of them is none other than the very same distinctive saddle worn by Django, Jamie Foxx, in Tarantino's previous film, Django Unchained. How Django's saddle ended up in Warren's possession is anyone's guess, but honestly, the mystery is probably far more intriguing than any explanation Tarantino could possibly give. Number 19. John Ruth foreshadows losing his arm. A little later, Warren ends up punching outlaw Daisy Darmague, Jennifer Jason Leigh, in the face after she spits on his personal letter from Abraham Lincoln. This causes Daisy to fall out of the carriage, and because she's cuffed to bounty hunter John Ruth, played by Kurt Russell, he too is dragged out with her. As Ruth lays on the floor beside Darmague though, he says something incredibly telling of his fate later in the movie, saying, "Like to rip my goddamn arm off." Of course, near the end of the film, Darmague ends up freeing herself from Ruth's corpse by hacking his arm off in supremely grisly fashion, just as he hinted at some 2.5 hours earlier. Number 18. Smithers stares at the audience. Here's a fun little nod to the audience that's incredibly easy to miss. When Ruth and Darmague first seek refuge from the blizzard in Minnie's haberdashery, General Sanford Smithers, played by Bruce Dern, is shown sitting down on the left-hand side of the frame. Keep your eyes fixed on him though, as when Ruth and Darmague enter the establishment, he knowingly turns towards the audience and eyeballs them for a brief moment. Though he stops short of winking at viewers, it's as if Smithers is basically telling them, "Hey, you, buckle up for the ride because stuff is about to go down." Given that the film is structured and presented very much like a stage play, and it was actually performed as a play before it got released in cinemas, it's quite fitting that Smithers appears to briefly break the bounds of the screen and make a connection with the viewer. Number 17. Oswaldo is related to Inglourious Basterds' Archie Hickox. Tarantino has a knack for creating characters who are heavily implied to be the ancestors of other characters in his more contemporary set movies, and The Hateful Eight is no exception. Local hangman Oswaldo Mowbray, played by Tim Roth, is later revealed to actually be Pete Hickox, a member of the gang seeking to spring Daisy from custody. And given that names are never given out randomly by Tarantino, it's fair to assume that Hickox is an ancestor of Inglourious Basterds Lieutenant Archie Hickox, of course played by Michael Fassbender. Accepting that both characters are British, it tracks, and if there was somehow any doubt, Tim Roth himself stated around the movie's release that he was indeed the great-great-grandfather of a character from Tarantino's World War II epic. Number 16. The sign for Minnie's haberdashery is in Tarantino's handwriting. When we see the outside of Minnie's haberdashery, the handwriting for the scrawled sign just might look familiar to Tarantino fans, given that it's actually his very own. Tarantino has a tendency to scroll the title pages of his scripts by hand, and given that he has a highly distinctive handwriting style, it's clear that his own penmanship was used for the sign of Minnie's haberdashery. It's an easily missed piece of trivia if you've never perused a Tarantino script, but if you have, there's a good chance you'll spot this one basically instantly. Number 15. Senor Bob smokes red apple. Tarantino features a few fictional brands in a number of his movies, chief among them being Red Apple cigarettes, which have in some form or another been spotted or mentioned in Pulp Fiction, Kill Bill Volume 1, Inglourious Basterds, Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, and yes, The Hateful Eight. Roughly an hour into the movie, it's mentioned that Minnie, played by Dana Gurrier, rolls her own cigarettes with Red Apple tobacco, and later Minnie name drops the brand herself. A more subtle invocation comes when we see Senor Bob, played by Damian Bashir, smoking, and Tarantino's narrator mentions that he, quote, enjoyed a manzana roja, that of course being Spanish for red apple. Number 14. The sly reference to a classic Kurt Russell movie. Quentin Tarantino is very clearly a fan of John Carpenter's seminal 1982 sci-fi masterpiece The Thing, which just so happened to star one of the film's leads, Kurt Russell. And so, in one of the film's several nods to The Thing, Tarantino has Russell's John Ruth paraphrase a line spoken by Russell's protagonist from the movie, R.J. McCready. Early in The Hateful Eight, Ruth says that, quote, one of them fellas is not what he says he is, which is rather similar to a memorable line from the start of The Thing, where McCready says, somebody in this camp ain't what he appears to be. Given that paranoia is the central theme of both movies, it's certainly a fitting callback. Number 13. Daisy laughs at Oswaldo's name and accent. Shortly after Ruth and Donoghue enter Minnie's haberdashery, they're introduced by Oswaldo Mowbray, and this scene contains a subtle hint that things aren't quite what they seem. Immediately after Mowbray says his name aloud, we can see Daisy smiling with glee for a brief moment. Now, why would she do this? Because of course, he's working with her, and she's well aware that Mowbray isn't Mowbray, he's Pete Hickox. Daisy's evidently amused at him adopting a hammy posh accent and silly name for his cover, enough that she has almost given the game away with her first opening big grin. Number 12. It features music from The Thing and The Exorcist II: The Heretic. Tarantino's love for John Carpenter's The Thing is best expressed through the fact that The Hateful Eight actually features 3 pieces of unused music from The Thing's musical score, as was composed by Western legend Ennio Morricone, who also earned his first Oscar win for his work on Tarantino's film. The tracks Eternity, Bestiality, and Despair were incorporated into The Hateful Eight due to Morricone's time constraints while assembling the movie's score. But that's not the only horror movie Tarantino paid oral homage to. He also used Reagan's theme from Morricone's score for 1977's The Exorcist II: The Heretic. You wanna know a not so fun, totally baffling fact while we're here? Morricone's The Thing score received a Razzie nom for worst original score. I completely understand why John Carpenter would want to be left in a locked room with the folks who did that, because this industry will never be able to atone for the crime of panning The Thing when it first released. Seriously. Number 11. The testicular throwback to Inglourious Basterds. Of the many things Tarantino has proven throughout his filmography, he's made it abundantly clear that he loves showing the male reproductive organs being absolutely destroyed to smithereens on screen. And in The Hateful Eight, he even offers up a self-referential homage to this fact, when Daisy's brother, Jody Donoghue, played by Channing Tatum, shoots Major Warren in the testicles, but not before quipping, "Say adios to your huevos." Apart from this being just a really funny line, this is also a nod to a similar moment, of course, from Inglourious Basterds, where Sergeant Stiglitz quips, "Say auf Wiedersehen to your Nazi balls," before shooting Major Hellstrom square in the knackers in that movie's amazing bar scene. Django Unchained also features 2 instances of comical genital mutilation, though they sadly don't come with the same punchy one-liner. Number 10. Oswaldo talks to the floor. Shortly after Ruth and Daisy enter the haberdashery, Ruth goes to make some coffee, and Daisy loudly mentions to Oswaldo that the new sheriff of Red Rock, Chris Mannix, the always brilliant Walton Goggins, is traveling with them. A moment later, Mowbray then loudly repeats this information, which, while a seemingly innocuous attempt to get clarification from Ruth, is actually far more calculated. In retrospect, knowing that Mowbray is one of Daisy's collaborators and that Jodie is hiding underneath the floorboards, it's clear that this whole exchange allows Daisy, Oswaldo, and Jodie to get on the same page about who Ruth is traveling with. Number 9. The lack of bare feet. Even the most casual of Tarantino fans is well aware of the filmmaker's comical fascination with feet, with most of his prominent movies featuring close-ups of bare feet, typically those of women, at one point or another. Yet, The Hateful Eight is a rarest of exceptions in Tarantino's filmography, given both that the movie transpires in a single location, and, more importantly, it takes place during a freezing cold blizzard, where it would make no logical sense at all for anyone to be walking around without shoes on. Frostbite and chilblains be damned. While Tarantino probably could have snuck a barefoot in by having somebody take a shower or something, he evidently decided to let it go in this instance, probably aided in part by most of the ensemble being male. Number 8. The first death doesn't happen until 95 minutes. Death is a mere inevitability in a Tarantino film, and while Inglourious Basterds and Django Unchained didn't waste much time on the brutal bloodletting front, The Hateful Eight makes twitchy viewers wait their sweet time for it all to kick off. It's actually an incredible 95 minutes, almost the total runtime of Tarantino's directorial debut Reservoir Dogs, before anyone dies in the movie, and Major Warren opens fire on General Smithers, hitting him in the chest and killing him stone dead. And again, given the movie's beefy, near 3-hour runtime and how expertly Tarantino builds suspense leading up to the first burst of violence, the wait is almost certainly worth it. Number 7. Kurt Russell's performance is a John Wayne impression. Western fans might have noticed that Kurt Russell's performance as John Ruth basically feels like an impression of John Wayne in every fibre of its being, the vocalizations and body language in particular. But the nod to the Western legend actually goes further than that. When Daisy tells Oswaldo about Chris Mannix traveling with them, Ruth says, "Ah, Sheriff of Red Rock, that'll be the day. That'll be the day," is a line repeatedly spoken by Wayne's protagonist Ethan Edwards in the masterful 1956 Western The Searchers, and given Tarantino's clear fondness for that movie, even blatantly replicating its iconic doorway shot at the beginning of Inglourious Basterds, there's no way it's a coincidence. Also, actually, while we're here, let's throw a little bit more appreciation to Kurt Russell in the comments section below. Let me know your favourite performance of his there. I mean, mine personally is Jack Burton in Big Trouble in Little China, which is also my favourite movie ever. But yeah, let's get the Kurt love going down there this time, and also maybe cheekily give the video a like while you're at it. Number 6. Jennifer Jason Leigh breaks character. At this point, it's extremely well known that Kurt Russell accidentally destroyed an antique 1870s guitar while filming the scene where he snatches a guitar from Daisy and smashes it to pieces. What you might not have known, however, is that Jennifer Jason Leigh's shocked reaction in the scene was totally genuine. Unlike Russell, she was well aware that he was handling the real antique guitar rather than a prop duplicate. And so, when Daisy shouts, "Whoa, whoa, whoa!" while looking around the room, this was the actress effectively breaking character and looking at the film crew in shock. Thankfully, she didn't actively break character enough to blow the take, allowing Tarantino to still use it in the final film. As for the museum which lent the guitar in the first place, they no longer allow their instruments to be loaned out to movie sets, which, yeah. Number 5. Joe Gage quotes Inglourious Basterds. Midway through the movie, Ruth asks Michael Madsen's Joe Gage to hand over his gun. But before being persuaded to do so, Gage retorts, "A bastard's work is never done. John Ruth." That might sound like the sort of pulpy, hard-boiled dialogue you'd expect to hear in any Tarantino joint, but it's actually a little more than that. It's a nod to the tagline from Inglourious Basterds. The marketing materials for Tarantino's war film prominently displayed the text, "A bastard's work is never done," which was also a line featured in the scene that got cut from the final film. It appears that Tarantino liked the line enough to resurrect it in this movie. Number 4. The secret meaning of Silent Night. Here's a brilliant, even ingeniously subtle piece of foreshadowing hidden in plain sight within the scene where Senor Bob plays Silent Night on the piano. If you know your music, you might be aware that the notes of the opening line, Silent Night, Holy Night, are G-A-G-E, as in Gage. As in Joe Gage. And given that this is the time at which the coffee is fatally poisoned, it's basically Tarantino's brilliantly sly way of cluing in the most attentive, musically inclined viewers that they should be keeping an eye out for Joe Gage, who later admits to poisoning the coffee. Number 3. Mannix is always the first to follow Warren's orders. Once it's all said and done, we can appreciate that Chris Mannix was one of the movie's few, somewhat good characters. But amid all the hand-wringing over his true allegiance, Tarantino actually made it pretty clear much earlier in the story. Following the whole poisoned coffee debacle, Major Warren tries to take charge of the situation by lining everyone up against the wall and making them follow his commands. Notably, it's Mannix who is always the first to follow Warren's instructions, whether doing what he says or replying to his questions. This tees up that he is, in fact, who he actually says he is. Number 2. Joe Gage loses his cool in the background. Before we learn Joe Gage's true nature for ourselves, there is a sneaky hint a little while earlier, when a very pissed off Ruth hurls his bowl of stew in Daisy's face as she laughs at him. Look to the back right of the shot though, and you'll notice that Joe Gage stands to his feet immediately after Daisy gets splashed with the stew. On an initial viewing, this might be pawned off as mere curiosity on Gage's part, or even just mild concern, but given that it's later revealed that he's part of Jodie's gang, it's clearly him assuming an offensive position in case Daisy's life is put in danger. And number 1, Daisy's angel wings. At the end of the movie, Warren and Mannix hang Daisy in the rafters for her misdeeds, and for a moment, the snowshoes behind her protrude out perfectly from her shoulders, giving the impression that she's wearing angel wings. Now, Tarantino isn't so much saying that Daisy is an angel, because she's categorically anything but. Instead, this was apparently a total accident which Tarantino noticed during shooting, but he liked it enough that he decided to keep it in the final shot. Once again, sometimes great movie moments happen by pure happenstance, even when a director as exacting as Tarantino is involved.
Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. Number 20, Margot Robbie wears some of Sharon Tate's jewelry. Though she ultimately may not have spoken words in the finished flick quite as often as many may have hoped, the moments Margot Robbie does get to wander around the screen as Sharon Tate in Once Upon a Time in Hollywood are still rather gripping. The Australian actor radiates star quality as the young Hollywood sensation, and fully captures the captivating presence of Tate throughout. What you may not have realised, however, is that one of the major ways that Robbie was able to connect so strongly with Tate as a character during the making of the film was by wearing some of her real-life jewelry. Said bling was loaned to her by Tate's sister Deborah. And not only was Robbie actually wearing some of Tate's very own jewelry during the flick itself, she also borrowed some of the late star's partially used perfume when getting into character too. That's pretty cool. Number 19, Michael Madsen's Cadillac making its second Tarantino appearance. Once Upon a Time in Hollywood boasts a number of Tarantino regulars, with the likes of Kurt Russell, Zoe Bell, Bruce Dern, and Michael Madsen all coming back for one more QT ride. What you likely missed though when watching many of those sequences involving Brad Pitt's Cliff Booth just cruising down a Los Angeles highway is that the vehicle he was driving, which was actually owned by Rick Dalton in the movie, was also returning for another appearance in the Tarantino universe. Said 1966 Cadillac Coupe de Ville actually belonged to, of all people, the aforementioned Michael Madsen. with it also being driven in Reservoir Dogs by the actor in that 1992 instant classic Tarantino movie. That's not the only returning vehicle that pulled into this Hollywood tale either. Number 18, the bride's car shows up again. Yep, that's right, joining Michael Madsen's absolutely gorgeous cream vehicle turning up for another appearance in a Tarantino movie is the 1964 Volkswagen Carmen Ghia that's also driven around by Cliff Booth in Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. You likely didn't spot the fact that Uma Thurman's The Bride infamously drove the exact same model and colour during Kill Bill Volume 2, and in a scene which saw Thurman eventually actually crash into a tree in real life, something that Tarantino himself has classed as the biggest mistake of his life. And in another interesting note, it turns out that Tarantino's own stepfather also drove him around in the exact same car back in '69, which is pretty cool. And it's also the exact same year that this film is set. Number 17, that's the actual Playboy Mansion. Early on in Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, QT takes viewers to a party at the iconic Playboy Mansion, with this get-together containing a few famous Hollywood faces, including Sharon Tate, Steve McQueen, and Michelle Phillips, all letting their hair down a little. You may be wondering how they were able to recreate such a realistic-looking version of the mansion for this scene. But many did not realize that this was actually very much the real deal. That's right, this was the actual Playboy Mansion on screen. After speaking with the person that now owned the mansion that once belonged to Hugh Hefner, of course, Tarantino and the gang were able to add in as many details as they could from that specific time before they began shooting the party sequence. However, it is worth noting that the Playboy magazine owner Hefner only actually moved into the property in 1971. So a Playboy party at the location in '69 wouldn't have really been possible, would it? Number 16, a Django Unchained set was used for the movie. Did you catch the somewhat familiar setting visible during the opening scenes of Once Upon a Time in Hollywood? As Rick Dalton and Cliff Booth sit down for an interview with Alan Kincaid on the set of NBC's Western TV show Bounty Law, the pair are shown to be sitting in the middle of the show's ranch set. And that very same Bounty Law location, Melody Ranch, was actually used all the way back when Quentin Tarantino was also shooting Django Unchained, with that set also being reused for some of the Lancer TV show scenes that are found during Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. Put simply, Melody Ranch, the same place that has been used as a set for the likes of The Lone Ranger and Westworld, has very much become a major part of the Tarantino-verse. Number 15, the Meta Zoe Bell appearance. As already mentioned, the terrific Zoe Bell has been a frequent collaborator with Quentin Tarantino over the years, being Uma Thurman's stunt double during the Kill Bill films, also doing a few stunts for Inglourious Basterds, starring as herself in Death Proof, appearing in The Hateful Eight, and popping up as stunt coordinator Janet Lloyd in Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. But if you weren't aware of Bell's history of working with Tarantino beforehand, and the fact she was actually acting as the stunt coordinator on set for Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, it would have been easy to miss the fact that her role in this 2019 Hollywood tale was actually about as wonderfully meta as it gets. With the knowledge of Bell herself very much being in charge of ensuring that all stunts were performed safely during the flick, watching her unleash hell as Janet at the sight of stuntman Cliff Booth carelessly beating up Bruce Lee and wrecking her car in the process becomes that little bit funnier. Number 14, the Inglourious Basterds fiery connection. Along with the aforementioned Django Unchained set being visible during Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, there's also another fascinating realer-than-real Tarantino universe connection seemingly present in this movie that is quite easily missed. The director famously opted to murder Adolf Hitler within a movie theatre in his version of history during the events of Inglourious Basterds, with that explosive scene eventually seeing many a Nazi getting horrifically burned alive. And sure enough, when talking about Dalton's career with Al Pacino's casting agent Marvin Schwartz, a film by the name of The 14 Fists of McCluskey is mentioned. Viewers then see Dalton creating a familiarly fiery scenario as the actor sets fire to a room full of Nazi officers, this time via flamethrower. Though it's not a perfect replication of the Inglourious events, it definitely feels like a nod to that other previous Tarantino burning Nazi scene. Number 13, the Kato fight homage. Speaking of nods and homages present in Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, Tarantino actually managed to sneak in a pretty cool physical detail into Bruce Lee's fight with Cliff Booth. You see, as Lee and Booth both throw down on the set of The Green Hornet, it was actually pointed out by the author of Bruce Lee: A Life, Matthew Polly, that the guy playing Bruce Lee in the movie, Mike Moe, well, he wasn't actually fighting like Bruce Lee would in real life. He was unleashing a style created by Lee for the character that he played in that aforementioned series, Kato. Kato. Specifically, the jumping sidekick that Mo delivers during the fight is pure Kato, according to Polly. And he also explained how the first few punches and blocks seen during that fight felt more like traditional Hong Kong Kung Fu movie choreography. To summarize, Lee also wearing Kato's black gloves during this particular fight with Brad Pitt's Cliff Booth just made Polly feel like the entire thing was more of a Kato homage than a Bruce Lee homage fighting-wise. So now you know. Number 12, the many pieces of Hollywood foreshadowing. The frequently stunning and satisfying world of Los Angeles in 1969 created by Tarantino for this 2019 dramedy isn't just something that's nice to look at and listen to. I mean, it is that of course, but it also contains a few subtle moments of foreshadowing if you're listening and looking hard enough. Take some of the music heard when Cliff Booth is just driving his way around Hollywood, for example. The Neil Diamond tune by the name of Brother Love's Traveling Salvation Show actually mentions very early on a hot August night. Something that feels like a bit of a nod towards the fiery events that go down at the very end of the film. You know the ones. Then you also have the moment Rick Dalton explains the contents of his book to his young co-star Trudy Fraser on the set of Lancer. With his comments of the cowboy involved injuring his hip and slowly becoming more useless by the day, predicting how his stunt double Cliff Booth actually injures his own hip at the end of the movie when he gets stabbed by one of the Manson family invaders. Booth would then note how he wouldn't die from the injury, he'd probably just walk away from it with a bit of a limp, himself possibly becoming slightly more useless by the day in the aftermath. Number 11, the Tarantino-verse brands. Along with this movie's few instances of marvelous foreshadowing, the much-loved Tarantino-verse brands are also there to be found throughout. Now, obviously, it wasn't too hard to spot the brilliant nod to QT's legendary Red Apple cigarettes brand during the movie's end credits scene, with that scene being a commercial for the brand starring Rick Dalton himself. And there's a little bit more on that later on. What less folks may have spotted was the passing mention of another Tarantino brand within this Once Upon a Time in Hollywood tale. Look closely at a bus moving through the streets of LA in one scene and you will spot on the side of it a big old advertisement for Big Kahuna Burger. You know, the fast food joint seen in everything from Reservoir Dogs to Pulp Fiction. Honestly, I hear they got some tasty burgers there. Oh yeah, and thanks for tapping on this particularly tasty video today too. If you're liking what you're watching, then hit that subscribe button down below for more What Culture on your screen. Number 10, that's the real Maltese Falcon. As Margot Robbie's Sharon Tate wanders into a bookstore to pick up a copy of Tess of the D'Urbervilles that she'd ordered, more on that later, you'll likely remember the star sharing a moment with a little statue of a falcon. You may not have clocked that this wasn't just any old little birdie though. This was actually the Maltese Falcon seen in the titular 1941 movie. Not only that, you also likely didn't realise that this wasn't simply a prop designed specifically for Once Upon a Time in Hollywood to be used here. It was 100% one of the real falcons used in that 1941 movie. It turns out that Leonardo DiCaprio is actually a part of a group that owns one of these iconic little pieces of movie history. Apparently, a few of them were made for the original Maltese Falcon movie, with this specific statuette going missing for 50 years before finally popping up at a flea market in 1993. It was eventually sold to DiCaprio and his pals for $300,000 and ultimately popped up in Once Upon a Time in Hollywood in this very scene. How cool! Number 9, Tess of the D'Urbervilles. As previously mentioned, the reason that Sharon Tate found herself in this Maltese Falcon boasting Westwood bookstore in the first place was due to the fact she wanted to buy a copy of Thomas Hardy's Tess of the D'Urbervilles, a pure woman faithfully presented for her partner, infamous director Roman Polanski. Far from being just a random old book, you may have missed the fact that this was actually a novel that eventual fugitive Polanski, who would flee the US in 1997 after pleading guilty to statutory rape, would later go on to direct when it was adapted into a big screen feature in 1979. The story goes that the director was inspired to make the movie after being gifted a copy of the book by his wife, Tate. In reality, said novel was actually bought when Sharon was in Europe, not LA, and after giving Polanski the book and saying how she'd love to star in that particular movie one day, she hopped on a plane and went back to America. That'd be the last time her husband saw Sharon because after she got back to America, she was then murdered by the Manson family whilst Polanski stayed over in Europe completing a film. When the drama, eventually titled Tess, was released a decade later, it contained the words, "To Sharon." Number 8, Cliff's Hateful Coffee Pot. On top of various top stars and vehicles returning for one more Tarantino adventure, a little old prop decided to add another Tarantino film to its CV during Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. Keep an eye on the background as Cliff prepares dinner for both himself and his loyal pup Brandy. and you'll be able to see a very much blue coffee pot sitting on the stove. That very same item is also seen during Tarantino's previous film, The Hateful Eight, too, with it being the same pot that would ultimately contain some poisoned coffee in that 2015 Western. As one rather sharp Reddit user would comment, hopefully they washed it out before it landed in Booth's kitchen, yeah? Number 7, a real Manson song was sung. As already noted during this list, Tarantino's use of music and the various things that are heard on the radio, or we'll get there, in Once Upon a Time in Hollywood is actually quite fascinating. But it's also unexpectedly chilling on occasion too. You know that song we hear the various young girl members of the Manson family singing when we're first introduced to them during the movie? Well, though you no doubt didn't miss the fact that it was really creepy, you probably didn't know that this particular song was an a cappella version of one that Charles Manson himself wrote. That song is called I'll Never Say Never to Always and could be found on the cult leader / singer-songwriter's 1970 album, Lie, The Love and Terror Cult. Lovely. Thankfully though, as confirmed by the movie's music supervisor Mary Ramos to Variety, they were informed after choosing to spend money on the song to use it in the feature that no one associated with the Mansons or the Manson family saw a single penny of that money. Instead, a trust was set up for the victims, so that's something. Number 6, Quentin Tarantino's hidden poster cameo. While this one isn't something you could technically miss within the movie itself, it is quite a fun little cameo that you probably didn't spot on your way into the theatre to watch the 2019 hit. Hidden amongst an utterly gorgeous retro promotional poster for the movie that boasted just about every single character in the damn thing, is none other than the director himself making yet another cameo of sorts in one of his pictures. Over the years, QT has shown up in everything from Reservoir Dogs to Django Unchained, of course, and adds a small appearance sitting behind a camera in this poster to his ever-growing list of cameos. Because why the hell not, eh? Oh, and he also voiced the director of the Red Apple commercial too, which is pretty fun. Number 5, the disappearing rearview mirror and Rick's rapidly changing hair. No movie is perfect, folks, and the odd continuity error here and there is to be expected, even in a movie as big and well crafted as Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. Sure enough, the two leading stars themselves, Brad Pitt and Leonardo DiCaprio, actually find themselves in the middle of a pair of easily missed mistakes in the runtime. While the former roams around LA in Michael Madsen's Cadillac, just keep a close eye on his rearview mirror because it goes from being there, he's even checking it, just looking behind him, doing all that kind of stuff, to disappearing completely. Now this was probably done because they were obviously shooting over, like Brad Pitt's shoulder from behind, and the mirror's there, you might have been able to see the camera, so that's probably why it happened, but it still sticks out like a sore thumb once you look at it. Then you have Rick Dalton's magical locks. Oh, I'm jealous. As the fading star talks about his hair with Sam Wanamaker, keep an eye on it because it goes from being really messy at one stage to being completely slicked back, all without DiCaprio ever once touching it on screen. Now good luck on seeing that, my friends. Number 4, the 1969 Columbia Pictures logo. Another cute detail that may have passed more than a few viewers by was visible during the opening few seconds of Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. The specific Columbia Pictures logo that could be found here before the movie had even begun was actually the exact same one that was used all the way back in 1969. Again, the year that this movie was set. A Sony company was also added to the iconic image of a lady holding a torch. With this studio, a massive one during the golden age of Hollywood, actually being bought by Sony in 1989, and adding their company to the image from 1996 onwards. Nice touch, cutie. Number 3, all those radio ads are actually real. Back to the many intriguing sounds heard during Quentin Tarantino's love letter to LA, and to the various radio announcements and tunes heard playing within the vehicles found in Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. Again, you'd be forgiven for assuming that the ads in particular were simply specifically created for the movie. But the truth is, a ton of viewers were actually obliviously listening to some very real commercials and DJ intro and outros that the director and music supervisor Mary Ramos put together after listening to 14 hours worth of 93 KHJ radio from the 68 to 69 period. In the end, Tarantino decided that all of the tunes, the commercials, the DJ intro and outros that could be heard in his movie had to be ones that were very much used on that station back in the day too. Because in his words, if it didn't play on KHJ radio in that time, it just felt like he was cheating. And in the end, fans were gifted with one of the greatest and most authentic driving soundtracks of all time. Number 2, a rather iconic scream. Another quick notable piece of audio that you may have possibly missed as you were settling down for your first, second, or even third viewing of Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. During the opening stages of the picture, as we see Rick Dalton gunning down enemies as Jake Cahill in Bounty Law. Listen out for the noise that erupts from one of his wounded foes as they fall off a roof. Yep, that's very much the iconic Wilhelm scream that's been heard in everything from Toy Story to Star Wars over the years, being used within the first minute of Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. Tarantino just couldn't make a movie about all things Hollywood without tipping his own hat to the most iconic sound effect in movie history, could he? Number 1, so many iconic LA locations are visible. Finally, Quentin Tarantino's love letter to Los Angeles in 1969 was always going to shine a spotlight on some of the area's most iconic landmarks. And whilst being swept away by all of the larger-than-life characters and the consistently mesmerizing soundtrack and locations seen and heard here, many probably didn't realize that a lot of the moments that were captured on camera were actually filmed within and in front of these legendary real-life LA places. The real Musso and Frank Grill, where Rick actually sits down for a meeting with Marvin early on, as we've already mentioned, was actually used to shoot that marvelous scene, with Hollywood's oldest eatery being shut down for 5 days for the shoot. The place worked a treat, mostly because it looks pretty much the exact same way it has done since it opened in 1919. They even got to use plates from the 60s too. What more can you ask for? The aforementioned real Playboy Mansion also pops up on screen, and the Mexican restaurant El Coyote, where Sharon Tate ate her last meal, makes an appearance, with Margot Robbie even shooting her scenes in the same booth that Tate sat in with her pals for the feature. Tarantino also rolled back the years by replacing the LED marquees on the iconic Bruin Theatre and the Fox Village Theatres in Westwood Village with real ones. Briefly turned a Taco Bell into a Hamburger Hamlet, a Starbucks into an Italian cafe, and gave Stan's Donut Shop, a joint that had been open since the mid-60s, a makeover too. Put simply, the director and the rest of his team did everything they could to make LA as much of an eye-catching character as the rest of their absolutely stacked cast. And they did a pretty good job too, if I do say so myself. Very well played.